Hey guys and welcome back to my channel. This is part 4 of What If Naruto Was in Elden Ring. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and also go and support the author, link in description. The migration of people coming from all across the lands between had not ceased in the past few days, but the numbers had finally leveled out. Where once there had been sporadic groups numbering from a couple to a couple hundred, now the process was mostly organized into a nice, neat line of people. It wasn't a perfect system by any means or measure, but proximity to what was, and in many respects still is, a school, a system had been imposed and was mostly abided upon, despite how many people grumbled about how their feet hurt and wanted to move into their new homes already. The sight of the floating city, dubbed Neo-Caria since the new flags had been put up, was a balm to the senses, though incidents were kept to a minimum. But the traffic of people is a kind of chaos that casts shadows that are difficult to account for at the best of times, let alone the start of a nation's rebirth. Crime and opportunists lurked in the shadows of disorganization. There were at least 3 black markets and 1 brothel that had been set up within the fabric walls of the tent city, and any census taken, internal or external, had a margin for error that numbered in the low hundreds. All of this went a long way to say that there were some within the camp that should not be, and those who were in command would have a conniption if they knew just who sat at their doorstep. One such individual made his way through the shadows of the tents to avoid one of the main thoroughfares, keeping his shrewd and intelligent eyes hidden in the shadows of his hood as he gauged the pedestrian traffic, the towering form of the academy standing proud in the near distance. He was an aged gentleman who moved with a refined grace that most of the lands between had forgotten, but he kept to himself and observed mostly, looking for his time to strike. He ruminated for a moment that strike was perhaps the wrong word. The gentleman was a man of principle and thought of any work he was given in banal yet respectful terms, even if what he had been sent here to do was distasteful to say the least. A dark deed my master asks of me, he thought to himself forlornly. Ever since he had begun his trek to the lakes he had been plagued with reticent thoughts and doubts that did not befit the trust that his master had in him. Worry and doubt were 2 companions that were close at hand in your youth and crept back up on you in your twilight years, but the gentleman would not have trusted any of his peers to take the task. Partially because he thought that they had gone a mote off the deep end, but their lusts for chaos would have left them blind to spot that they were not the only ones with dark designs for the stewards of Liurnia. Stepping under a low-hanging washing line, the gentleman caught a foul sweetness on the air, following it until he found a ramshackle scaffold that he climbed to get a better look over the sea of tents. There were hundreds, nay thousands of shantytown dwellings with groups hiding in the shadows. He leant on his senses, physical and those honed by time and experience, sweeping the camp until he finally saw them. A group of 4 hooded figures were camped around a smoldering, no hide nor hair of a cooking pot to be seen. Their cloaks were long, ragged and filthy, but served to cover their forms completely. But there was something off about them. The gentleman knew that it was less the garments they wore that were dirty, but rather the ones wearing them were emitting filth that seeped from them into their clothes. Those 4 are of the rot, he realized, frowning deeply. They would be trouble. One of them twitched, an unconscious action of the afflicted, causing a glint of light and fire that was pulled back under their cloaks in the blink of an eye. But the gentleman had seen it, his gaze as scrutinizing as a prowling hawk and experience enough to recognize the profile of a wicked-looking sickle. They were not the only ones. All across the camp since he had come here, the gentleman had spotted near 80 of people hiding in the shadows, making ready weapons, catalysts, and even thumping animals within crates. It was no idle boast or blooming mafia. These men and women were from all over. They wore the garb of people from all over the lands between, in ages that ranged from neophytes yet to taste their first blood to old codgers looking for one last adventure before their bodies failed them. Adventure? Yes, what a subtle trap that word was. Men and women alike could be driven to the greatest ills of gods or men in the name of adventure, where the gray world parted to black and white. Am I any different? I have been sent here to do something of such foulness it turns my blood, he thought to himself, pursing his lips. He turned and looked up at the academy, caught by the new flags that hung from its turrets. He had come here once before, a very long time ago, a lifetime, but he remembered the bounty and majestic wisdom of Caria. All the secrets and schemes of the lands between, laid bare under the guiding light of the moon. To even reveal a tarnished spoil under seeming gentle gold, he whispered to himself. It was then that he made a decision, one that this nameless aged man sat upon a shantytown spire did not know would eventually save what dignity his master still had. Dark deeds I may have been sent here to do, but I am a knight through and through. I shall still strive to do good. Let my results earn clemency in the end. The sound of thundering hooves cut through the burble of life, catching the aged gentleman's attention, looking across the skyline until he spotted a posse of horsemen on the causeway. They galloped with all the might their steeds could muster, riding with all due haste for Raya Lucaria's gates with strange tidings. 0.0.0.0 Naruto planted another kiss on Renala's cheek, butterflies in chest when her sapphire eyes filled with joy and mirth. She shifted against his front, the gleaming silks of her bodice-covered back gliding smoothly against his shirt, pushing further into his embrace as he tightened his arms around her waist. "Does the queen like her mid-morning break?" he asked jokingly, blushing when Renala rubbed her cheek against his. "It is an adequate distraction from monotony, it does you credit for suggesting as such, dear consort." Renala replied in her usual antiquated parlance but with undeniable affection. She drummed her fingers lightly over his thigh, relishing the light twitch she felt against her rear. "However, I think it far too early for that, but take supreme comfort in knowing you make a congenial throne in the absence of my own." The shinobi was seated in a plush winged back chair with his fiancée sitting in his lap, luxuriating in front of the fire of their shared apartments. Being an active autocrat again meant that Renala and Naruto both had to attend the wonder that is court. And even though their responsibilities were mainly just making sure that utilities and people moving into the floating city was progressing at a good rate, it had a level of boredom to it that made Naruto question how none of the Hokage had ever contemplated throwing themselves from the top of the Hokage tower every time a meeting came to an end. The blonde Uzumaki being who he was, however, had suggested more like dragged his tall fiancée by the hand that they take a small break to relax, which had quickly morphed into cuddling and making out in their apartments. Why was Renala sitting in his lap and occasionally shifting her weight to get a delightful reaction from him? "If I am sat on a throne, then I can honestly tell the Luddites that I am undertaking queenly business," she had told him, coming out of a searingly passionate open-mouth kiss that had shot lightning up Naruto's spine. He was no doormat, or throne in this analogy, but he couldn't argue with the pleasurable results. Naruto looked at Renala's face, framed by a curtain of straight raven black locks, and sighed serenely. "God, I love you," he said honestly, giving voice to his thoughts. Renala's eyes softened and she placed a tender kiss upon Naruto's royal headband. "I am yours, and you are mine. So sure as the sun chases the moon, ire time immemorial. You gave me sense after so long in darkness, thus I give you my countenance in totality." Naruto pressed his face into the crook of his love's neck, each of them trembling with care. "You'll do the same for me." Renala purred, "Your guiding moonlight, leading you back home no matter how far away you may be." He laid a hand on her cheek. A sharp rap at the door brought an end to their mingling, causing both of them to pout, though neither would ever admit it. Sighing dramatically, they rose from the chair and straightened their clothes before going over to the door to see what kind of inconvenience life had decided to manifest for them today. Opening the door, they found Moongram standing there with a deeply troubled look, immediately sobering both from their merriment. "Moongram, what's wrong?" Naruto asked the loyal knight and attendant. Moongram looked at the younger man, opening his mouth to speak but finding it difficult to form the words. He was inexorably drawn to look at Renala, who raised an eyebrow. Naruto had seen Moongram worried before, but right now his lined face spoke of something he didn't seem to fully understand. "My queen. And lord," he tacked on, remembering Naruto's new station, "the scouts have found something in the wilds." He sounded agitated, like he was desperately trying to hold back a truth he did not fully understand but knew was likely to cause distress, understandable given Renala's less than stellar history of taking bad news. Still, Naruto was someone in charge now and had an innate need to alleviate worry and help those who needed it, be that his fiancée or her long-standing attendant. "Something dangerous?" he asked, rolling his shoulders to loosen them. After swallowing thickly, Moongram began to explain that a scouting party had been conducting a routine patrol in the lands near the old Carrion Manor, gathering numbers on the finger crawlers there in hopes of purging them once things were correctly set up at Raya Lucaria as the new capital. "Were there more than you were expecting?" Moongram shook his head. "I was not part of the scouting party, but they say that there were no finger crawlers at all. They had all been slaughtered." "That's great. One less thing to deal with. Those things are damn creepy," Naruto said with a nod, his smile dimming when Moongram did not seem to brighten. "What slew them?" Renala asked, thumbing her chin in thought. "It would take a well-to-do force to eradicate those digit-daubing degradations. Or a single warrior of great repute." Moongram wilted at his queen's words. "We think we know." For what was there in their place was not inconspicuous. Naruto gestured for the old knight to keep going. A golem, 50 feet in height wielding a large pike. Renala stiffened, eyes narrowed to slits. Moongram looked at her with a pained expression, the weight of her eyes prizing the last of his knowledge from him. bearing the sigils of Caria and the Redmanes. Rennala inhaled sharply, her hands clenching in surprise and pain. Naruto was at her side in an instant. "What's wrong? Is it trouble?" he asked, wanting to comfort his fiancée. Rennala said nothing, her face a mask of emotions. Surprise, shock, uncertainty and even pearls of hope amidst the murk. Naruto squeezed her hand, snapping her back to the present to look at him. She gave a wan smile at his efforts before her face hardened, only her eyes now showing that glimmer of distress. "I'm riding out to the manor. Do not follow us." Snapping her fingers, she was suffered by sapphire light, motes of white-blue swirling around her as her attire began to change. The light brought Moonbrim out of his stupor, immediately launching into a litany of complaints. "I must protest this course of action, my queen. I cannot in good conscience allow you to leave the academy without an honor guard." Rennala emerged from the vortex of glinting light in riding attire, a pair of black and red breeches, a kama with glintstone belt and a quilted brigandine made of hardy black leather and matching shoulder cape. "PFF'd," Naruto snorted, before beginning to laugh and vanishing into the apartments. Returning with a pair of boots that he pulled on. "Lord Naruto," Moonbrim asked, confused and slightly offended at Naruto's blasé attitude. "Really Moonbrim, you're used to Rennala's speech and you didn't pick up on it." Naruto looked at him, giving him a cheeky look. "She said don't follow us." Strapping Kaiman and the moonlight greatsword to his back, Naruto followed his betrothed from the room, leaving a bewildered Moonbrim in their wake. 0.0.0.0 The betrothed duo's flight from Raya Lucaria had been quite something to behold. Rennala couldn't wait for the stable boys to saddle a Mustang fast enough for her liking, and Naruto's giant crawfish mount was too slow. They were burning daylight for every second not spent on track, ergo Rennala had dipped into her arcane mastery to acquaint them with a steed that would get them to where they needed to go with time to spare. "Whoa," Naruto called from behind the queen, his arms around her waist to hang on for dear life as she drove their horse to the edge of sense and beyond. Both queen and eventual king were astride a spectral stallion made up of pale translucent light and mist, looking as if it had been shaped from the very moonlight. It had all the finery of a royal horse down to its decorative saddle and plumed bridle. But in truth it was a magical construct modeled after the concept and essence of a horse, just a step below the spirit steeds that some of the demigods were known to ride. And by the stars above could Rennala ride. It had been centuries since she had had cause or impetus to gallop headlong through her lands rather than take a stately ride in a carriage, but she worked the damn nag as hard as its translucent legs could carry the two of them. And when you took into consideration its lack of stamina, that was pretty damn fast. The old Karain manor was not especially far from Raya Lucaria, deep within the woods of Liurnia, roughly 3 leagues from the lakes, and they were aided by the fact that Rennala knew paths through those woods that no one else did. "Where did you learn to ride like this?" Naruto asked, the tassels of his kingly headband whipping back and forth in the wind. Allowing herself a moment of mirth despite her single-minded focus on getting back to the manor, Rennala indulged her betrothed's curiosity. "In mine youth, I was less martial-minded than most and learned the sorceress of the moon. But a queen or king must learn to ride. Count Ymir, a stalwart vassal to our arts, led me to an Albenuric huntress. Seldom few of their number retain use of their legs, so they become wondrous equestrians to compensate. She taught me to ride." Naruto nodded, recalling the few Albenurics that he had encountered during the establishment of the floating city. While they had initially distrusted him, the endorsement of Rennala had gone a long way to ease tensions, and they had been relocated to some of the first settled houses of the floating city. The forest began to slowly thin as they rode on, light filling their vision before finally they burst free of a copse of trees. Rennala blanched and brought the horse to a stop in a skid that churned up the grass, still touched by morning dew. The Carrion Manor expanded before them, a grand, if slightly dreary and decrepit stronghold made from wet-looking gray stone. It could be put down to having been abandoned for so long, but that was not what drew Naruto and the queen's eyes. Over 100 finger crawlers had been put to the sword, their arachnid-like gray flesh and multi-jointed fingers curled up on themselves like dead spiders. All of them wore some form of grievous wound that had likely been their end. Some had been stabbed with a massive implant, or hacked at with extreme prejudice. In truth, it was hard to tell where one crawler ended and another began, all churned up into charnel viscera and chits of bone. However, the majority of them appeared to have been bludgeoned to their ignominious end, crushed by something of immense size and weight. The cause of which was what both Naruto and Rennala were staring at with awe and shock. Towering at the heart of the impromptu midden was a giant of chiseled stone. A golem of such proportion and artistry that it made the construction golems used to refurbish the academy look like fresh babes. It was 15 meters in height with limbs as thick as Naruto was tall, sculpted from hardy gray stone. Fractals of glittering light shone from the behemoth in glitters of white and gold, mineral imperfections in the stone that gave it its strength. A bastion of metamorphic adamant. It was, clearly, a knight. Its torso had been chiseled into a rocky cuirass and its head was a visored knight's helm. Most imposingly of all was the weapon it carried. The segmented multi-jointed fingers of its hands were clenched shut, one around the haft of an axe-headed pike nearly as tall as the golem itself, the edge of the blade glowing deep blue. "Oi!" Naruto breathed out, very impressed. "Whoever built that has a real talent for big and brash. No offense," he tagged on, fearing his fiancée may take offense to the fact he was complimenting someone else's golems. "None taken, for 'twas I who built it so very long ago." Renola dismissed the horse, it melted away into particles of magic as both its riders dropped deftly to the wet grass. "Seriously?" the Uzumaki asked, his look turning from surprise to appreciation. Renola looked up at the great golem's chest, at the top of its pectorals. 2 tilt shields were hung over each side of its chest, each bearing a sigil. The right one was the crossed staff and sword of old Caria. She shifted her gaze to look at the left tilt shield, overcome with nostalgia and sorrow when she saw a proud lion clutching a greatsword. The sigil of Redmane Castle, her son's sigil. "I hath spoken often of Radon," Renola said, favoring Naruto a look. "'Twas always such a kind boy. Strong beyond all measure but with a kindness that I hath seen in scant few before or since. In the days before my parting with Radagon," she kept the sting from her voice. While she knew Naruto would think no less of her, it pained her to make him think of her in the arms of another man. He took command of a great following. Meritocracy with compassion, putting honor in their general like the lion he hoped to be. That's what they called themselves, the Redmanes. They looked up at the massive golem, silent and inert. Renola pointed the tip of her catalyst at the Redmane crest on the tilt shield. "When Radon was given Caelid as his fief." "Caelid," Naruto blurted out, surprised, who would ever want to live in Caelid? Renola deadpanned at him. "Oh, sorry. Please continue." Renola sighed half-heartedly. "Thou never saw it before the shattering. 'Twas once a beautiful place. And in recognition of my sweeting son's achievement, I built this golem and gifted it to him. To show that Caria would always be there for Caelid." She trailed off, her face turning downcast. A tightness had been building in her chest ever since Moongram had told them about the golem. "Do not be proud of a monument to my sin of inaction, my sun and stars," she whispered. Still, there was something wrong here, something that Naruto was quickly able to cotton on to. If this was down in Caelid, then what's it doing here? Caelid is a long way away from here. And if this thing is something that is guaranteed to have an emotional connection to you. They both looked up at the golem, its tilt shields pushed out tauntingly proud, yet the great titan inert as the stone it was formed from. "Then it is most assuredly a trap," Renola agreed. They were both on guard immediately, scanning the treeline and shadowy depths of the Carrion Manor with their senses both innate and supernatural. The lack of response set them even more ill at ease. When nothing happened, Renola chanced a step forwards, growing closer to the golem. If she could examine it, then she could gain some understanding of how it could have gotten here. "Maybe it heard the call through the grace and came here when you called," Naruto suggested, advancing with her another step. "An interesting theory, alas one logistically unsound," Renola answered, raising her catalyst and releasing a thin film of light that scanned up and down the golem's body. "Its arms are quick but its legs are slow. 'Twas designed as a sentinel, to unleash hell and stand tall. Not march, meaning it was bought here." Naruto raised his foot to step forwards again, and as once the world seemed to slow down before her. There was something wrong, some sixth sense within the arcana that knew something was about to go wrong, but she could not see it. If you cannot see signs of your knowledge, then look for what eludes you. Every shadow was where it should be, magic flowed through the air and lay lines correctly. She scanned the ground until finally she spotted something amiss, a depression in the ground too straight to have been happenstance. Once right under her fiancé's descending foot. "Naruto, no." His foot hit the ground, treading on the out-of-place line. Immediately it lit up with abyssal grayish light, extending into an esoteric rune that the full moon queen was alarmed she did not recognize. She didn't sense an iota of magic from it, but Naruto grunted in confusion, likely sensing some other energy that unsettled him. It fell upon Renola a moment later, a sickening highness that clawed at the back of her brain, like eyes trying to peek inside her. A thump of magic permeated the air, a clunk against the senses that heralded magical matrices activating. Dust fell from the joints of the golem and its head sprang up, twin dots of light shining from behind its ceramic visor as it fixed its attention on them both. Naruto stepped in front of Renola protectively, slamming a fist into his palm in challenge, his body coiled to respond to any provocation. He was proven correct when moments later the golem reared back its left hand and swung it forwards with an overhand lob. The queen's assessment had been on the money because it was blindingly fast despite its massive size. Naruto was faster though, scooping up his girlfriend and leaping backwards out of the way of the slam that punched a crater into the earth, shaking the trees around them. Putting Renola down, the blonde was surprised as the golem reared its left fist back again and made an exaggerated show that did not fit with a punch, more like a throw. Naruto realized, leaping forwards into the air to intercept the projectile. The arm whipped forwards, whistling through the wind as it tore the air before opening its hand, launching its cargo spinning through the air. Naruto maintained his path, fearless and challenging. After all, there was nothing to fear from a simple chest. Renola saw the chest and instantly knew the gambit. Naruto, don't. Naruto drove a Rasengan into the chest, reducing it to splinters and causing it to explode into a miasma of silvery mist. Naruto looked around himself, confused as the mist enveloped him, face freezing, aghast when he felt a hook close around his navel. Renola was already halfway through a spell, fingers dancing around her catalyst and muttering a counter curse to try and prevent what she knew was about to happen. A blasted transport chest, she raged. She was almost ready to hit Naruto with an anchoring sorcery to keep him from being dragged away. Her catalyst chimed eerily and she fired it, a beam of purest blue light streaking towards Naruto in a straight line. And passing right through him as he was teleported away, a second too late. Blast, she raged, a pit forming in her stomach at the thought that Naruto had been taken from her. The initial gut reaction of his potential demise filled her with terror, but her understanding of both arcane mechanics and Naruto's incredibly hardy bod and adamantine will comforted her. Wherever he had been sent was somewhere he could deal with. I however did nothing to blunt her sudden and profuse amount of anger at being separated from him. The golem was incapable of perceiving its maker's anger, already set on its next pre-programmed task. It raised its now empty left hand high above its head, the blue light of an azure comet building up in its palm. Renola conjured a translucent shield around her, a dozen of her own sigils spinning into life, each building up their own azure comet that were locked onto a different part of the stone giant. Her fondness for her creation aside, Renola was more than willing to pulverize it down to dust to vent her frustration at being set adrift from her son. The golem released its azure comet, firing it straight into the midday sky in a pillar of greenish-blue power, surprising Renola. She did not let that stop her, unleashing a tide of power. 12 pillars of condensed magical power ogling the force of a falling star blasted forwards, hitting the golem before it had any chance to mount a defense. Its hardy body weathered the beams for a few seconds before sliding backwards, its artisanal body worn smooth by the withering deluge of light. "I who made you, know that you are unmade," she declared, intensifying his spellfire, the beams widening until they merged into a single wave of power that consumed the entire golem. The wave persisted for a number of seconds before Renola cut the flow of power. It collapsed into a tide of magical particles that filled the air in a mist, revealing that all remnants of the golem were glowing shards of superheated rock. The full moon queen inhaled sharply, getting a rein on her anger. All of a sudden, a rumble shook the ground beneath her feet, a tremor that caused her to look around followed by several more. A series of distant booms rent the air, deep throaty explosions that echoed over the forests around the Carrion Manor, the speed of sound trailing after the way their progenitor had shaken the earth. She looked over her shoulder in the direction of the sound, putting it together where the blasts had come from. The academy. Gods above, how simple it had been. Draw her and Naruto away from the academy with a distraction and then attack the fortress. I have to return post-haste. This distraction is, she stopped in her tracks, this distraction is, a whistle whistled through the air from behind her. Still going, she bellowed, spinning on her heel with the bladed tip of her catalyst pointing outwards. As she turned, she reached out to the ample magic still in the air and drew it towards her, coalescing it into the broad spectral Carrion greatsword that she swung with all her might. The magically enhanced construct smashed headfirst into the shaft of a long and morbid-looking scythe, its gray steel blade angling down at her as she struggled against the force the wielder had put into it. Sparks of blue magic and ferrous heat leapt from the point of contact, casting fractals of light and shadow over the faces reflected in the long curved scythe blade. One Renola recognized as her own, eyes narrowed in quickly falling battle haze and teeth clenched in effort. The other she did not. It was the face of an aged and wizened man, his face long and lined. He wore a wide-brimmed leather hat and had a shock of lank gray hair that trailed to the base of his neck. His eyes were frightfully intense, beady orbs that bored into her like knives of their own. Rennala dug her heels in and pushed harder, increasing the length and width of her construct until the tip of the scythe was pushed away from her. "Away with you, ruffian," she yelled, finally breaking the blade lock and sending the strange old man to leap away. The old man hummed, pleased about something. It would be of no substance if the hunt was over so soon. "You've a rod up your spine, woman. I'll give you that much. Very few men have been able to hear me coming, and those who did fell like threshed wheat. And here I thought that a bourgeois aristocrat would have blood too blue to boil to a fight. Name thyself, interloper." Rennala maintained the oversized greatsword construct, her mind prepping 16 spells to loose if she found his answer wanting. Looking him over, she saw he had a strange form of dress and one of his legs was a prosthetic. Ignorance shan't afford you clemency. To strike at a monarch in her own lands is a capital offense. He tutted contritely at her words, raising the shaft of his scythe and, unexpectedly, disconnected it into a stumpy contraption and the blade, now a barbaric sword. Ah, the caustic prattle of the peerage. I had thought I'd heard the last of it from the lips of the vile-blood queen. But you are right, I know you, full moon queen, but you don't know me. The name is German, and I am but an old hunter. Rennala's face remained stony, intelligent eyes analyzing everything she could about the old man. Despite the lines on his face and the light stubble on his chin, there was corded muscles beneath his clothes, at ease with her presence even as she cranked up her killing intent. This was a man who was at ease with the prospect of blood and violence. "Well met, old hunter," she said with glacial calm, shrinking her sword back to its catalyst, then pointing the jeweled head at the man. "What gall have you to part a queen from her betrothed?" German cocked his head to the side imperceptibly. "You mean the beast." Beast. It was a simple word but held so many connotations. But the way he had said it, with such derisive veneration. Like Naruto was not quite human, just game to be hunted. And just like that her patience was expended. At a mental trigger, the sorceries began to spill forth like a thunder of rain. A Belkheim birthed a phalanx of 9 conjured swords over her head in a halo, each tip locked onto one of the hunter's vital points. The burst forwards like lightning bolts loosed by an angry good and flying through 3 more magical sigils, each imbuing 3 of the swords with a different element. A twitch of her fingers randomized their flight path, and a cock of her catalyst caused the swords to be dozens more illusory doubles. Some flew true, others span through the air like buzzsaws, and even more flew along spiraling or angular flight paths. German moved, dripping low and moving forwards in a spurt of speed that caused him to momentarily blink from Rennala's vision. Fast, she thought, jumping backwards and loosening gravity's hold on herself to glide backwards. Pushing her mind further caused German to blur back into view. The summoned swords came around to chase, but the old hunter moved with a grace you would think impossible with one leg. He ducked under a spinning sword that passed harmlessly overhead but swung his peg leg backwards to clip it on the hilt, knocking off its trajectory and causing it to collide with a second. The 2 swords had been carrying fire and ice detonated in a plume of thermal shock. Capitalizing on sudden windfall, German removed his other foot from the floor and allowed the pressure wave to carry him forwards with even greater speed. He flipped forwards, the gray blade turned into a streak of light that haloed his tumbling flapping robes. Rennala swept her catalyst down towards her feet, a line of purple winking once from the tip. He strained out in his flight, converting his centrifugal force into frontward momentum with his burial blade thrust ahead, aimed to bury itself in Rennala's heart. At the moment he crossed into her personal space, the edges of her mouth turned upwards. Purple light radiated from the floor beneath. The hat-wearing hunter was poised to skewer the queen. A pressure took hold of him, causing his beady eyes to widen as he was dragged downwards to collide with the earth. Gravity magic had never been Rennala's forte, but she had made it her business to have enough aces up her sleeve to pull out any time she needed them. And as she looked down at him, Rennala could not help a mean satisfaction seize her. German's offhand shot up, the short, club-like contraption pointed at Rennala's face, finger depressing on the iron trigger the moment she noticed the hole in the end. Bang! A gout of flame barked from the end of the weapon, spitting a tightly packed spread of silvery shot that sent Rennala's head reeling backwards with such violence that her neck seemed to break. German opened his mouth to say something but shut it when Rennala's face, unharmed but very angry, whipped back down to face him. Circling around her face were 2 small magical sigils, one that was cracked as it held the spread of ball bullets in place. Holding her catalyst high, she invoked another martial sorcery, and the scepter was clad in another bright blue glowing construct, this one with a massive bludgeoning head. Where is he? She yelled, swinging the colossal mallet downwards on the old man's head. Gurman crossed his burial blade and club-like firearm across him, tanking the hit and letting the force carry him out of the gravity trap. He performed a backward somersault, unhooking the long shaft and affixing it to the head, reforming the scythe and resting it over his shoulder as he came to land in a crouch, staring at the Carrion Queen. Somewhere, unpleasant. Growling, Renala rose into the air, surrounding herself with dozens of magical circles, renewing the battle with earnest. Gurman was all too willing to continue. I'll give you one thing, Full Moon Queen, you have the prettiness of the moon, but there is behind those eyes. Are you the thing I was sent to hunt after all, or are you a woman gentle as the moon, not the moon itself? Spellfire was his only answer. 0.0.0.0. Traveling via a transportation mist is a novelty disconcerting experience. Compared to the jarring instantaneous jolt of flying raging or even the hellscape of light he had experienced when he was dragged to the lands between, this was a continuity of consciousness issue. One moment he had been hanging in the air in front of the Carrion Manor looking into the distressed face of his lover, then there was a blank period where all he could think of was rolling mist. When reality reasserted itself, Naruto was struck by a sense of vertigo as he slipped from the shimmering gray mist. Falling. He was definitely falling. He blinked several times but all he could see on all sides was red. And before he knew it he was hitting the ground with a disgustingly wet splat. Everything in this place was varying shades of red, all of them putrid and filthy. From the malformed petrified trees to the sky above and especially the scarlet muck that coated the floor like the foulest bog. The surface of the sanguine filth churned repulsively for a few moments before an arm burst free from its questing ooze. The arm braced itself on the surface before a figure clawed themselves from the detritus, coughing harshly and spitting out fat globs of the stuff. What the fuck? Naruto coughed, feeling the urge to dry heave at being so thoroughly soaked in the stuff. He clambered to his feet and looked around, staggering slightly. Everything hurt. From the tips of his toes to the ends of his hair, everything was thick with an acrid and personal agony that seemed to crawl into his bones. Kurama. I know, I'm already on it, the greatest of the Biju said, flooding Naruto's body with a tide of his healing chakra, a cleansing fire to push away the encroaching shaping kiss of the rot. Naruto's body was covered in golden chakra before he could even blink, vaporizing the visceral evidence of the affliction. The scarlet rot, he questioned, still feeling as if he'd been skinny dipping in magma. He had felt the rot once before, very early into his time in the lands between when a certain bald squatter had suggested he make a detour into Kaled. The journey had lost him his favorite pair of sandals but Kurama had been able to hold back and burn out the blight. It feels so much stronger here, he admitted, happy no one could see the pain he was in even with Kurama's cloak. It clung to everything here, hanging in the very air as vapor rising from the red sludge he stood upon, testing his prodigious pain tolerance. Kurama glowered, you're gonna have to stick around for a bit, I have to concentrate on burning this shit out of you. It's like it's sentient. But Renala, Naruto tried to argue, can take care of herself. Focus on staying alive while I keep you alive. Kurama barked, losing himself in his concentration as the rod attempted to dissolve the cleansing chakra. Naruto growled, hating the feeling of impotence. His ears quicked, hearing something from the bog surrounding him and spotted movement that he instinctively jumped away from. Not a moment too soon when a gnarled and ulcerated arm clawed itself from the depths to try and take him. He unsheathed Kaiman and lopped the arm off in a lateral arc, sending whatever it was squealing back into the depths. But whatever it was had been nothing but an outrider for a stampede. The swamp of rot churned like the guts of a ravenous beast, all manner of horrific abominations pulling themselves from the depths to try and take Naruto. Naruto gritted his teeth and drew both swords. If he was going to be forced to stay here for a while then he would at least vent some frustration that was quickly blooming into true anger. And where better was rage to bloom than the swamp of Ionia? 0.0.0.0. The day had been perfectly normal at Raya Lucaria so far. All the subjects, those who had moved in and those who now held posts as servants of the budding reborn monarchy. Soldiers, knights, scholars and sorcerers all made their way around, happy with their slow but sure progress. With no warning, a pillar of greenish-blue light shot high into the air, seeming to split the sky and drawing the eyes of everyone able to see it. The light was reflected in the shimmering eye of one lunar princess Rani, who had been holding her own court with Blade and Ig over the whereabouts of one preceptor Saluvis. He had yet to come to Raya Lucaria despite both the Moonlight Concordat and Rani's own decree for her agents to return home. Funny time of day for fireworks, Blade groused, a creeping feeling of tension filling him. Rani blinked before saying, that was an azure comet. Good mother. She was cut off when all at once, all across the shore, explosions began to ring out. Rani hopped down from her chair and sprinted for the window, using her forearms to lever her child's body up onto the windowsill to look out at the destruction being wrought. Fiery pillars of fire burst into life all across the tent city on the shore, all the way up to the outlying lattices of the floating city. Snapping her fingers, a scrying spell flushed to life over the window, magnifying her vision 1,000-fold and letting her see the details of each explosion closely. People were running around screaming, trying to evade the flames or salvage what they could from the flames. IG craned his colossal head around to look at the vision, his hidden face communing a frown through aura alone. What on earth is going on out there? Blaive too studied the screen, his more keen battlefield experience picking out several figures amidst the throng who did not move with the graceless gait of the mob. There, he jabbed a finger at one part of the screen and instantly Rani zoomed in on them. It was a pair of men clad in mail and plate, hurling oil and fire bombs into unsuspecting dwellings before moving on, shouting and whooping as they went. It's an attack, Rani concluded, looking over the scene with steel in her voice. She panned the visage across the entire scene and picked out perhaps 8 groups of 10 that were doing the same, all of them armed, all slowly but surely moving towards the academy. Where are mother and father? She shook her head lightly, still unused to the term on anyone that had not been Radagon. The doors to the room burst open and an eclectic group came clamoring in, Moongram at their head. They are away at the Carrion Manor, where I wager that sorcery came from. The old knight said, obviously having heard Rani's question. Following him was the tall and broad form of Loretta, as well as representatives of the knights and soldiers, the sorcerers who had Swordfieldy and even the volunteer militia that Naruto had been assembling these past weeks. Luring the leaders away before striking to cause chaos, it's a classic tactic, Loretta observed, tightening the straps of her armor. It's what I would have done, Rani said under her breath, remembering the chaos of the Night of Black Knives. Behind her she heard the impromptu war council begin to bicker over their course of action, but no matter what she did Rani could not escape the grim specter of her past deeds, watching Godwin's eyes open after a blade that she had made had destroyed his soul. It had been a mistake, one that she had run from the consequences of. Perhaps this was her chance to rectify the ill. Moongram is the ranking knight, he should have command of the defense. Loretta argued, her pale face set in a grim line. While I appreciate the vote of confidence, Lady Loretta, Moongram said with humility that did not befit the current crisis, Lord Naruto's militia do not know me, nor are they drilled enough to be directed without my direct oversight. In a chaotic situation I fear spreading our forces too thin. I shall take command. Everyone in the room slowly turned to look at Rani who still looked out of the window, bruising her hands across it to switch the view to various scenes. Princess Rani, Moongram mouthed almost sadly. Are your ears a shoe? I know none of you have come down with deafness, the idiocy of my stepfather having its place in driving people mad. Rani turned and hopped down off the windowsill, walking across the distance to the central table. Face the facts, I am the ranking royal of Neocaria in the absence of mother and father. I know all of you, your strengths and failings, and am the only one magically adept enough to use the Curtains of Tranquility, she explained her reasoning, using the official name of the floating city's magical defense. They all exchanged a look in silence and Blaive found himself smiling wolfishly, he seemed to find her diminutive stature a fun juxtaposition to her authority. Moongram was the one to break the silence. What would you have us do, my princess? The little girl smiled, using her multiple arms to gesture to each person in turn. We sortie our forces. As far as I can tell the attackers number no greater than 80 and are using confusion to their advantage. Each of you will take command of a faction and move to get the civilians safely inside the academy walls. Moongram, you shall take command of our trained forces, the knights and men at arms. Focus on getting the people inside. Yes, my princess. Moongram snapped off a quick bow and jogged from the room, helmet under his arm. I will bring the walls of tranquility to stand. You, she looked at the sorcerer and drew a blank on his name. What is your name, lecturer? He wore the sash of a lecturer. Cagliostro, my princess, he provided, gulping in trepidation at the lunar princess's authority. Lecturer Cagliostro, you will take command of the sorcerers and work within the walls to support Moongram's men at arms. Set up checkpoints and drop as much glintstone on these invaders who try to breach the walls. Cagliostro nodded his giant scholarly helmet and mask and ran from the room to collect his catalyst. Rani ran a hand through her blue hair, a habit she would not admit she had picked up from Naruto. That leaves the matter of the main assault on the forces in the tent city and rescuing those trapped in the chaos. The militiamen that Naruto had gathered numbered about 200, most of them as green as the trees that ringed the lake, but a few veterans amongst them. Rani needed a rod of iron to break the enemy and manpower to evacuate the civilians. Finally, she came to Loretta. Knight Loretta. Yes, Loretta stumbled over the word, yes, princess. Technically speaking, Rani was no longer her princess since she had sworn herself to the Haligtree. You serve my brother, Miquella the Kind. Is it within your mandate to help those in dire need, those who cannot defend themselves? Rani asked, her lone eye boring into the Albanuric woman's own. Loretta nodded, it is. Where do you need me? Take command of the militia, rout the invaders and oversee evacuations. Break them like a rod of iron and dash them like a potter's vessel. My mother promised retribution to those who would spit upon the new beginning offered here. See these anarchists humbled. After a moment of internal debate, Loretta looked as if she had reached a decision and nodded. For kindly Miquella and an age of compassion, I shall defend Neocaria as a bastion of the values I hold dear. She pledged before leaving with the head of the militia at her back. I should probably tag along with Tall, Pale and Glowering, Blaive mused, pushing off of the table and moving to follow the knight of unalloyed gold. He was stopped when he felt someone grip his cloak and turned to see it was being held by Rani, who shook her head. No, assist Moongram in the evacuation efforts, make sure my sisters are safe. Rani. What is the point of being a shadow, sweet Blaive, if you cannot protect your family? She asked him, stopping the man-wolf dead in his tracks. He looked at her, moth twitching, and, Seru, on his lips before finally his lupine face softened. He tucked his hand under her chest and bowed, giving her a cheeky smirk, by your leave, my princess. It will be my honor. The man-wolf left her then, leaving her alone with IG in the room with the huge troll and Smith letting out a chuff of amusement. Would you class that as running with your tail between your legs? He asked rhetorically. When Rani did not respond, he extended his hand and picked the child-sized witch up, placing her on his shoulder before beginning the lumbering lope to where he knew she needed to go. Technically, the curtains of tranquility were another part of the wards and could thus be activated from anywhere if one was correctly keyed into the wards, but unless one bore a mark of office, the majority of the functions were inert. IG was still in the process of fashioning Rani a new catalyst for ceremonial purposes, and she could hardly expect him to finish it midway through an attack. Instead, he carried her up to Renilla's workshop at the top of the academy, near her and Naruto's apartments. Entering the crystalline and wood chamber, Rani pulled up a chair and sat on one side of the giant molten gold mural on the floor. I shall need your assistance for this, stalwart IG, Rani told the troll, who sat squatly opposite her. While the workshop was huge, it was difficult for the smith and war counselor to move around it without squashing anything. Aha! The troll chuckled warmly, belying his somewhat monstrous appearance. You are too kind, my princess. But the both of us know that you are a deft enough sorceress for any of your mother's spells. I am also, as young Master Naruto might say, big bone for deft work. Do not sell your dexterity short, Master Smith, Rani assured him. While I may have 4 arms, I only have 1 eye. And yours are some of the best for detail in the lands between. Extending all 4 of her arms, Rani grasped for the invisible threads of magic in the arm and gave them form, forming a ring of gossamer light between her and IG. Dark blue light filled the room as an object took form within it. A 3-dimensional topographical map of the lakes was soon a marvel to see. Hemispheres of information written in flowing sorcery script began to orbit it, listing off details of the status of the lakes on the macro level as well as much more idiosyncrasies that Renilla had designed it to read. Rani solely brought all 4 of her palms together, each trailing a thread of glintstone thinner than a hair. These she weaved into a film that grew and elongated. On my name is Lunar Princess Rani, daughter of Renilla, Full Moon Queen and Naruto, Eminent Sun King, I hereby draw the curtain. Let none who call Raya Lucaria home face danger on this day. She tossed the completed cloth at the representation of the floating city and began a masterstroke not seen in ages. 0.0.0.0 Adventure is a subtle trap. It is a benign thing from its outset, but all it takes is the smallest push away from the path for it to lead you to places that you cannot return from. It adds a notion of nobility and romance to everything. Those nights spent starving on the road, character building suffering, leaving your family to not know where you are for nary a decade because a wizard told you you were the chosen one. The call to adventure. But the further you go off the path, the more adventure begins to turn things from the gray that they are into black and white. They weren't firebombing innocent refugees for fun, they were saving them from life under a tyrant queen. All part of the adventure, all things to be proud of. and the only thing that could purge the stink of a guilty consciousness was more blood spilled in the name of good, to balance a scale as it strangled your soul. Their group hadn't had a name when it started, they had been drawn together for one reason or another for the Radon festival. But the arrival of the Daughters of Rot had spoiled that righteous sacrament from being enacted, leaving them all jilted and in need of action. But it was amongst their leader that something had broken inside. Witch hunter Jaren, Castellan of Redmane in absence of General Radon. He had brought them together, he had told them of the great deed they would perform, and in the absence of it they had followed him to do some good, ridding the world of the evil queen who abandoned her family to the shattering. They were Redmanes now, and while they could not challenge the stars, at least they could lay low the moon. "Leave this place, stand with the moon and you'll fall like it," shouted a Redmane cleric, his fist full of a lance of golden lighting that he hurled at a fleeing family. The lightning grazed the father and sent him tumbling to the floor, his wife shrieking in horror. Around him his fellow Redmanes set to their work, whooping for the joy of the fight. It felt so good to finally be doing something right. Some of their number were advancing into the outlying lattices of the floating city and were facing resistance. Monogram and Blade were working to evacuate people inside the walls as fast as possible while Loretta led her 200-strong militia into the shores in search of the 40 of miscreants. The arms and armor were light and each of the Redmane heroes were worth 5 of the militia, but the song of slashing steel and rampant spellfire soon filled the air. But then, something fell over the entire field of battle, a pressure of purest magic as the lakes themselves began to glow bright blue. Water flowing between the lattices began to churn faster, artificial ley lines of such complexity and strength that none but the Carrion could ever dare to understand the matrices, let alone try it. Quickly the water of the lakes began to rise between the canals of the floating city, each one rising higher and higher until it blocked out the very sun, casting the entire region in ghostly blue light. At their apex, the water crested inwards into a dome, entrapping both the academy and floating city in dozens of curtains of water that were thicker than a fortress's walls. These were the curtains of tranquility, the power of the lakes made manifest. The power of water flowing in a specific pattern at a specific time, sublimated by upwelling magic from the ley lines, turned millions of tons of water into a system of self-articulating, moderating and active defense. A score of dragons could try to breach these water walls for a year on end and still fail. The only way in was to follow the path of the floating city, a path that could be shut on the whim of the controller. The cleric gawped openly at the monstrous manifestation of magic. He had never seen anything so obscene. It defied all he knew of the Golden Order, and he would kill any that would blaspheme by trying to enter this heretical place. He advanced on a fallen child, drawing a spear from his back. "Fear not death, lad," the cleric said, raising the spear as the boy pleaded for him to stop. "'Tis better to die as one of the righteous than live as a sinner." He was about to plunge the spear down when he froze, everything below his neck feeling slack. His vision seemed to go awry, tilting his head when he didn't mean it to until he found his head rolling forwards beyond the point of what was possible. As his head hit the ground and rolled away, the last thing that crossed his mind, other than the dumb realization that he'd been beheaded, was the aged gentleman slipping a curved blade back into his cloak. "Are you okay, lad?" the aged gentleman asked the boy, offering a hand for him to stand. The boy stammered. "You are fine. I suggest you find your mother." And he looked at the headless Redmane cleric and snorted in dark amusement. "I doubt he cares what either of us think." The boy obeyed the aged gentleman's suggestion and ran off to find his mother, joining the line of people being ushered through the curtains of tranquility and on the long, winding road to the academy gates where they would hopefully be safe. The aged gentleman traveled with them, traversing the blue-hued watery world that the floating city had become. It truly was a marvel. But as he walked he overheard people wondering, just where were Queen Renala and King Naruto? Out fighting the enemies or inside helping those arriving? "If there a way that makes my job that much harder," he thought, drawn to the cries of those around him, "but I find misery a repulsive thing. If these people should require protection, then I will give it." Protection was something that they would need. At the gates, a group of Moongram's knights ushered in another large party of survivors, bidding them deep into the grounds and paying no mind to the disconcertingly sweet smell coming from the 4 cloaked figures in their heart. The Daughters of Rot shared a grin. They could sense their sister, she was so close now. They offered thanks to their mother and benediction to the Rot itself, who would have thought that jilting the Radon festival would give them the path they needed inside this otherwise unassailable fortress. There was simply one thing that did not make sense to them. As they had made their way into the throng under the cover of the panic, they had spotted 80 of the Redmanes. When they had left Caelid with over 100. .0.0.0. Jiren held up a lamp and continued to march forwards at the head of his 20 best men. Amongst the heroes of the festival, these were the greatest of their number. Each one a warrior who he would trust his life to in a heartbeat, and those with whom he would cut out the heart of this evil place that had abandoned his general. And his faith in his general was rewarded, for it had given them a way into the academy. The 21-strong group walked along a cavernous tunnel lined in dark silvery rock, all of it hummed with some unforeseen primal force. This tunnel ran all the way from the Carrion Manor to the lower levels of Raya Lucaria and was known to a grand total of 3 people on the face of the earth. Radon, Gaius the Albanuric and him. Apparently in his youth when training under the Onyx Lords, Radon had constructed a path in and out of Raya Lucaria so he could come and go without not even his own mother knowing. He had used his gravity magic to dig the tunnel deep beneath the lakes and lined its walls with heavy minerals taken from meteors that the mightiest demigod had either encountered during his tutelage or called down during a battle. As a result, the long and somewhat meandering tunnel was invisible to scrying, meaning they could sneak in and do their dark but needed work with total surprise. Those behind him were drunk on their own fervor, jeering and whooping about purging the unclean, but his mind was set. There was one in this place that he had to kill at all costs, an old wound that would neither scab nor scar till he had wrung the life from them. I come for you, Selen, you will suffer for your deeds. But if Jiren, for all his warped duty, thought his was the only force of a son forgotten to fall upon the new capital today, then he had missed out on one of his lord's fondest sayings. Bad house guests come in threes. .0.0.0. When the sorcerers had returned to their place under Naruto and Renola, there had been a great deal of moving stuff around. Even with Naruto, the golems and everyone else pitching in, a lot of the more esoteric magical trinkets had been moved into storage in the basement for later assessment and proper classification. Objects from all over the lands between and beyond. One such item was so ghastly to look at that upon being put down here had been covered with a sheet. But when the initial explosions had shook the lakes, the sheet had fallen loose, revealing the tall, chromed and bladed visage of an abductor virgin, inert and dead as the steel it was made from. A few moments passed before suddenly, unprompted, it sat up, and a dark orange glow began to thrum from its chest. Its bladed hands began to spin faster and faster until finally its chest opened, a cloud of silvery mist emerging from it to fill the room. When the mist cleared, 20 figures stood, armed to the teeth and baying for blood. Praetor Rykard's recusants had come home, and they could smell fear on the air. There was blasphemy to be had. .0.0.0. Naruto spun, his twin swords winds of death that reduced the rotted monstrosities to chum in flashes of black and dark green. He raged with all his might, his anger only growing with every single one he killed, inhaling the madness that rose from the swamp of Ionia and crying out for more. It was so easy to lose himself to the rage, so simple, and as the bodies hit the floor and the skulls piled high, a familiar voice was heard, plucking the strings of someone slowly but surely going mad. That's it, Naruto, lose yourself to it, get mad till there's nothing left. Maladies were something that Kurama had become intimately familiar with. Born as a construct of energy with a form that could be molded through will and time, the concept of wounds or even pain had initially been an unkind novelty that he could shrug off like warm autumn rain. It didn't mean he didn't understand the concept of pain, just that he had experienced so many different forms of it in nearly 1,000 years of life that the differences were academic unless it really stood out. The gold and silver brothers eating the meat from his stomach lining from the inside out until he was forced to vomit them out ranked as probably the most vivid pain in his recent life on a personal level. But in truth, Kurama, mightiest of the Biju, was more used to viewing maladies from a second-hand perspective and had done so for about a century, ever since a certain wood-loving Hokage had led his red-haired harridan of a wife onto the battlefield and stuck him with battery duty for the better part of 100 years with scant intermissions of attempting to escape. The great fox would never admit it, but part of the reason why he was able to think back on these times so candidly was how wholeheartedly he had bonded with Naruto. In the olden days there would have been a lot more cussing, screaming and declarations of taking over his Jinchuriki's bodies and murdering all they loved. He was a little cranky at the time, just a little. However, while his antipathy for his former jailers had been more volatile than fissioning nucleus, he had done his best to make sure that their bodies stayed in one piece from whatever malady or wound blighted them. It helped that the Uzumaki inherently possessed a reasonably formidable healing factor and vitality to their bodies and spirits that he usually just had to prompt it with a touch of chakra to deal with it. Anything that their bodies couldn't handle, then he could afford to be a little more direct. Broken bones. Send chakra to the wounded area to set the bone and quickly cause the bones to knit back together. chakra transforming to fill the gaps of anything smashed beyond repair, or dissolve a stubborn chip of bone that no longer fit into the hole it had broken away from. Flesh. Accelerate cell division and use chakra to rejuvenate telomeres so they didn't shorten their lifespan. Again, use chakra to form minor-scale patch jobs that healed without a scar. Poison. Just burn it from the bloodstream. Disease though. Disease was tricky depending on what it was. Usually Kurama would just have to boost Naruto's immune system if it was something that actually needed attending to. He wouldn't step in for something as blasé as the common cold. Things at the micro scale that affected cells and genetics required a level of finesse that you wouldn't think a 125 meters tall fox capable of. And failing that, carpet bomb it with chakra. If that failed, seek someone who knew what they were doing. All of it, went some of the way to describe why Kurama wanted to strangle Melania if he ever met her face to face. Because the scarlet rot was a fucking bastard of a disease. It didn't behave in a way that Kurama had ever seen any earthly disease behave. Instead of working through any mechanism or process that could be codified, it was as if the sanguine-colored soup made putty of the rules of reality in a sickeningly childish way. It would rush in and twist the flesh and mind, conferring malignant states on things that a disease should have no say over. Metal would rust, stone would melt, magical constructs would wither, and in their putrefied states spread the rot further, in new ways. In their time in the lands between, Naruto had come into contact with the disease once or twice and the results had been unpleasant but negligible. The metaphysical aspects of the disease were repulsed by their chakra, and the worst had ever come of it was a runny nose that smoked when it hit the floor. This was different. The swamp of Ionia was ground zero for the rot as the lands between knew it, therefore the potency of the affliction was so much stronger than any other. The red mud that Naruto's form now danced across as a whirl of twin blades was pure, concentrated rot held a shadow of that centuries-old great bloom. And with every splash of the rancid muck, every inhalation of the toxic vapors, more and more of the rot soaked into Naruto's body and mind. Kurama could deal with the body, and already he had purged 70% of the initial blight from his partner's countenance, but that lingering 30% gripped into him like barbed knives and Kurama was having a hard time working them loose. And the longer it took him, the more of this foul stuff piled on. I have to keep a constant stream of raw, unfiltered Biju chakra running through his body to keep the new rot from leaching its way in while I hit the stubborn parts in new ways that they won't be able to adapt to. Kurama aloud, his voice full of concentration, hands clasped into a ram hand sign, directing lances of golden chakra like the crack of a whip. The skittering squeals of the rot from each element he struck at offered hollow satisfaction, because there was one aspect he could not help with. The rot twisted the body and the mind. The only way to hold back the latter was force of will and mental fortitude. Naruto had that in spades, but will could quickly turn into anger, and anger was a fire that could rage out of control. Hang in there, Naruto, Kurama shouted, giving his partner moral support while he continued to purge him of the physical pains. Naruto did not respond. Kurama frowned, his dark lips pulling back over his long fangs. He sensed no sign that Naruto had even heard him, only anger that burned hot and righteous. Get your head back in the game, Naruto. 0.0.0.0. That's it, Naruto, you're doing great. Drive them back into the muck. Naruto did not respond as the words washed over him. The blonde was a strobing flash of golden light that span with blurs of deep green and white-hued black, whipping out to reduce a shambling creature of rot to mincemeat that was blown away in the small cyclone his swift movements were generating. Ionia's red muck gleamed hungrily, reflecting Naruto's gold light back at him in mellifluous vermilion. Dark shapes clambered from the swamp, insectoid creatures that let out pained yet joyful cries as they broke into sprints to get to Naruto, like moths drawn to a naked flame. He was the bright singularity at the heart of a black hole, his twin swords the accretion disk that shredded entire star systems to dust, and this black hole was hungry. The blonde himself though, he was angry, the angriest he had been in a long, long time. And for reasons that he could not quite fathom, he was struggling to think why that was such a bad thing. He stepped forwards, space blurring as he rushed the rotted troll that had decided it was its turn to try and take him down. Both his swords slashed in different directions. The moonlight greatsword took the troll's head while Kaiman split its torso down the middle. The troll stumbled, its body locking up and spasming, the putrid power of the rot forestalling the realization that it was dead. The inky black aura of death licked at the wounds along the great valley that Kaiman had sliced into its chest, the flesh turning ashen and dead as its quivering tissues became still. Too slow, Naruto though laconically, the fact that the headless and listing monstrosity had yet to crumble back into the mud drove his aggravation higher. An aggravation that could only be soothed through wrath. Raaaah. Naruto howled, a chakra arm expanding from his back with a Rasengan swirling into life in its palm. The ethereal appendage rocketed forwards and drove the fusillade of chaotic chakra into his latest opponent. The Rasengan detonated, enveloping the remains in a bubble of force that ripped its remaining limbs free. Naruto grinned, the fire of his anger burning brightly and pressing him on, falling upon yet more opponents, some who flew down from the sky or came from under them all. At one time a pair of giant misshapen jaws, twice as long as Naruto was tall, rose from the swamp on either side of him, its twisted teeth parting the muck like tombstones rising from a water-logged grave. He was effectively standing in the mouth of a giant submerged beast that had spent who knows how long bloating beneath the rot of this unholy cauldron. His heart thundered in his ears, gold eyes darting around, and quickly came to a decision. As the jaws snapped up like some giant bear trap, he held out both swords pointing to either side of him, skewering the ebony-colored chitinous flesh that made up the fell swamp thing. The red morass at his feet bubbled acidly, a cry of pain from mud-thick lungs. And despite that, more still came, running from all angles, to try to claw at him, embrace him into their vile covenant and change him into something awful, something that could not tell friend from foe. Naruto grit his teeth and heaved, a bellow tearing forth from his lungs as he spoke the words this whole ordeal had been egging him to say. I fucking hate the scarlet rot. Twang. He did not hear the sound, for it was not a sound, but he did feel it. The grandiose and harmonic vibration passed through him subtly, like the string of a harp had just been plucked by a masterful hand. Its reverberations passed through him from all sides. Naruto's insides twisted and suddenly his body felt hot, in a different way from the warmth he felt when donned in Kurama's chakra cloak. This felt as if certain parts inside his body were quickly heating up and coming to a boil. And across his chest, amidst the black lines of his chakra cloak, the sigils representing the great runes began to glow. Power welled up from within, a strata he had never felt before, urging for release. Naruto allowed it, letting the power of purest gold exploding from him in a dome that expanded out away from him. It caught the rotted kindred in its expansion, their bodies dissolving the moment they were enveloped. The dome expanded further, causing the charging rot creatures to beat a quick retreat, something about the feeling of the power so anathema to their existence that it scared sanity back into them for a time. Finally it gave way and Naruto was left, standing in the center of an island of hard, brown mud, his great runes winking one after another. A pause passed between them all, an ill breeze flowing across the land. Then the haze descended again, red overlaying Naruto's vision. Almost too quickly, but the anger called, and it sang louder than sense. It's something worth hating, a blight upon the land. A tumor the voice caught itself, on order. So thresh them like wheat. Naruto heard the voice but did not reply. He was riding the wave of his own anger. The thrill of it in Ionia was proving a mighty catalyst for losing sight on things. What mattered right now was swinging his swords. Slices becoming slashes, slashes becoming hacks and brutal cleaves. Plus, why would he question a voice in the back of his head? He'd been dealing with that since he was angry. Twang. And down the path he danced, the options forward slowly but surely thinning to another's tone, and a voice glowing clearer. They don't deserve the lands between. But you do, with my gentle fingers pointing the way. 0.0.0.0. The Carrion Manor had never been the most ostentatious seat of royalty in the lands between. It had the usual trappings of a place of power and a sartorial elegance that drew the eye, but it was positively reserved when compared to the gilded domes and ivory-colored towers of Lindell or the long-lost mega-structure of Fara Missoula. Years of decay and abandonment had taken the edge off that understated shine, and its current debacle was providing an even better case as to why Raya Lucaria was the new capital of Neo-Caria. Rennala floated through the air, flitting between the battlements of her childhood home with her face set in a scowl. Keen deep blue eyes swept over the courtyard she gracefully hovered over, hunting her prey. She spotted something shift in the shadow of a pillar and instantly attacked. The chime of glintstone sorcery heralded the arrival of 3 magical crests, each spitting a carrion phalanx carrying a different element. The first fire, the second air, the third lightning. They whizzed through the air, faster than the naked eye could track, shattering the pillars into large blocks of masonry. A gray shadow burst forth, sprinting away even before the tip of the first summoned swords had made it through the pillars. Gehrman raised his gun, firing a scatter of quicksilver shot at Rennala, who blocked it, her fading crests reforming into a temporary barrier that took the impacts. The phalanxes began to detonate in sequence, first the fire, filling the separated walkway with a globe of flame, then the air to fan the flames, making them turn white-hot and channeling them down the hull behind Gurman. He made to jump behind one of the remaining pillars when his eyes widened, the lightning detonation conducting straight to his peg leg and briefly seizing his movements. "Got you," Rennala thought as the fire consumed him. Her feeling of triumph was short-lived when she saw a flickering light from within the smoke and dust, a mix of orange fire and electricity. Not unexpected, her spells were powerful things. The lingering magic in the air would keep their effects going even on substances that couldn't burn. But that wasn't what gave Rennala pause. Her lightning was blue. The crackle there was blue-white. Flakes of paper filtered through the smoke surrounding the light. Rennala did not wait. She acted, waving her catalyst through the air and calling up a brace of azure commits ready to slag the entire courtyard. "I cast you down." A chunk of masonry the size of Rennala's torso erupted from the smoke and dust, flying through the air in the blink of an eye and catching the full moon queen in the chest. She flew back, her back cracking into the edge of the roof and knocking the wind from her lungs. Stars burst in front of her eyes, concentration momentarily lapsing and sliding down the wall into the courtyard. She shook her head to get her bearings, but there was Gurman, screaming from the smoke like something right out of a nightmare, his burial blade wreathed in fire and lightning. Her catalyst came up, catching the electrified flaming blade as its elderly wielder swung it horizontally. Reverberations rattled up and down the royal scepter from gemhead to bladed tip, but its masterwork craftsmanship held under the assault even as sparks of lightning and flame spattered the front of the queen's robes, causing her to let out a snarl and push back against the first hunter. "It seemeth thou doth have some manner of cantrip then, it stinks of parchment and ozone," Rennala said through gritted teeth, levering her greater height against the gray-haired attacker. The flaming burial blade wobbled slightly from the pressure Rennala exerted into the blade lock, but it held. Gurman smiled thinly at her. I was not able to bring much on this hunt, but flame and bolt paper seemed a good choice to face those that wield the elements. I'll admit it is not as aesthetically pleasing as your witchcraft," he replied with genuine humility, digging his heels in and bringing the blade lock to a standstill again, the shake leaving the sparking blades. Had it been under different circumstances, Rennala would have loved to quiz the strange hunter on his unique equipment, whiling away the hours in academic study by the fire and the comfort of her library. Eyes hardening, the Queen of Neo-Caria spread her awareness and gently oriented her staff, taking in her surroundings in a magical sense. The invader opened his mouth to speak again when a thin shaft of blue light erupted from the top of the catalyst, splitting into a string of gossamer thread that linked up with the abandoned yet still present azure comets. Gurman disengaged instantly, leaping backwards to get distance between Rennala and what seemed to be a suicide attack. But the full moon queen was not as self-destructive as she had once been. She jumped, her feet leaving the floor, and became suffused in an aura of expanding silver light, cocooning her in a translucent barrier that was her moon. "Fall," she intoned mentally. Immediately the constellation of azure death plummeted towards the ground as compressed magical bombs. It didn't matter how much distance Gurman got, 5 azure comets worth of magical power was about to be released. He still was not without recourse. His hand slipped inside his coat and withdrew something made of a chalky white substance on the end of a chain. It was a heartbeat too late. The 5 greenish-blue missiles of Carrion sorcery struck the ground and instantly released the totality of their magical payload. The explosions bloomed like blighted flowers, converting the majority of their energy into pure concussive force before melding into one another, increasing the effect by an order of magnitude. The day momentarily shifted to night as the hemisphere of magic heat and force swelled and spread, washing over the entire courtyard in a fraction of an instant, even as Gurman tried to guard himself. The blast took him, wiping him from the vista before hitting the Carrion Manor as a whole. The sections behind Rennala took the brunt of the explosion. Stone and mortar was sheared clear and pulverized before the wind of the explosion, which shrieked with a resonant chime instead of a traditional boom, totaled that entire wing of the manor. The other side of the courtyard took it little better. The shockwave shattered the far wall's upper facade like cheap glass, tearing the tiled roof clear in a rain of ceramic shrapnel that was tossed into the air, falling back onto the cracked and blasted ground as a withering hail. Smoke and dust filled the air in a tapered pillar as the light of day returned, swaying in the artificially created thermals like an ephemeral skyscraper. A single point of silvery white light cut through the gray cloud of grit that grew more defined as the smoke cleared, revealing Rennala's moon hovering sentinel where it had been before. Rennala looked over the scene from within the moon, floating on silent cushions of force. The raven-haired monarch blinked in curiosity. She appeared to be a little higher than she had summoned the moon, but the curiosity faded as she factored in the fact she now hung over the crater created at ground zero of the barrage. It was not her most precise work. It was more akin to taking a mallet to a stubborn bug, but she had made it work in a way that most sorcerers would never even dream of being able to do. Usually her moon was used as a projectile attack and she would only spend nominal time inside of it, but minutely changing its magical composition so it was on the same wavelength as her comets had made it temporarily immune to the shockwave of her attack. She had essentially turned the casing of a weapon into a dugout shelter to protect her from the collateral damage of her own attacks. Rennala scanned the savaged landscape before her and felt a pang of guilt. She had just totaled a large chunk of her childhood home. She chided herself, the analytical part of her pointing out that there were innumerable other ways of squashing the interloper instead of shock and awe. However, a much louder voice in her head, one fueled by passion and emotion, said that it was totally warranted as recompense for sending Naruto away. What both voices agreed on, was that she needed to turn her attention to getting Naruto back now that the lank-haired menace had been vanquished. A bolt of gray and black lightning forked from the building's ruins, bearing a fang of keen steel. It launched towards Rennala with such speed that the age-old Witch Queen almost lost track of it, nearly taken off guard. Shock seized as she saw that not only had German seemingly survived but had access to more unique abilities that he had yet to show. Her composure did not break and she was already in the motions of countering. Seeking to block it, Rennala instantly called up 3 magical crests that fired a stream of small glintstone shards and thin magical beams at the lightning. Then, to her surprise, the lightning changed direction, forking on a different vector. The 3 magical circles turned to follow the attack while Rennala called up 3 more, all 6 now orbiting her moon in case German attacked her from her blind spot. Glintstone volleys peppered the ground, kicking up puffs of dirt where they struck the ground, but again the lightning forked in a different direction, moving to dodge the rain of magical projectiles. Her eyes locked on something amiss about the scene. The lightning passed through one of the puffs of dirt on its latest sporadic direction change, yet it did not burn. It was cast aside as if something physical had passed through it. Surely not, she thought, an inkling of what was going on taking root in her head. She extended her hand, tracking the path the lightning took and laying a gravity pitfall there. She snapped her fingers and a rain of stars steamed off her moon's shell, raining down on the lightning from above and causing it to change direction again, passing over the gravity pitfall. Waves of purple light fanned out from the floor, snaring the lightning, and while it did not stop it, it was slowed for a fraction of a second. Long enough to get a closer look at it. Her mouth fell open in genuine shock. A tattered gray cloak, a wide-brimmed leather hat and a pair of pale eyes that stared right into her soul. It was not German's lightning, it was German himself. Sprinting with such speed and so low to the ground that he appeared even to Rennala's senses as a bolt of gray lightning. She gritted her teeth, intensifying the hail of projectiles trying to skewer or smash the first hunter as he returned to his true speed, forking again and again. She let magic flow through her eyes, sharpening her senses to their limit, and finally German came into true clarity. His age was no issue, moving with a fluidity and grace that would make trained dancers weep. He snaked around beams of magic with serpentine moments, vaulting over carrion blades and axes. He turned in the air, using his burial blade to subtly alter the trajectories of anything he could not dodge, and with all the subtlety of a cannon firing, went for her. Too fast, she thought, though the intense spellfire did nothing. She had him beaten in raw firepower and versatility, but he had speed and martial prowess that made him able to dodge and juke her spellfire. He was close now, too close. Too close. She had to drop the moon, the explosion would deter him and likely break his speed. She was a sorceress supreme and could hold her own in a melee, but blade to blade was never her strong suit. That had always been S domain. A pit formed in Rennala's stomach, suddenly awash with emotion without a source. She was remembering something, and it brought her a profound sorrow that stalled her action just a second too long. German took his chance, affixing the burial blade to its shaft but keeping the blade vertical. He fashioned a wicked glaive and flew at Rennala's moon, driving the weapon forwards with a yell of exhilarated zeal. Scram! The tip of the glaive pierced the moon with a sharp pinging sound, arcs of blue and white magic erupting from the rupture. He would not be repulsed, hoisting his weight and all the speed he had picked up into the thrust, and the moon buckled, revealing Rennala with her eyes and arms wide. In a desperate attempt to forestall him for even a moment, the queen thrust the bladed tip of her catalyst at German's face, seeking to pierce his skull. German jerked his head to the side, a searing line of pain stinging his face as Rennala appended a wound in his cheek, but his glaive was longer and already in motion. The weapon was about to land, impaling the full moon queen when she was surrounded in a white glow and magical particles that radiated. The blow landed, but instead of the meaty squelch of impaled flesh, German's actions were rewarded with a resonant clang of metal on metal. Rennala was sent flying backwards, crashing through what remained of her moon, and skipped backwards, falling end over end and gracelessly plowing through the ruined section of the Karain Manor. She came to a halt in a skid, her heels digging long furrows in the ground as she panted. But surprisingly, she looked almost nothing like she had prior to the hit. Instead of her usual robes, Rennala was now clad in a suit of close-fitting silvery plate armor. It covered her entire body with perfectly accented steel including gauntlets, cestus, greaves and sabidons. It bore a strong resemblance to Moongram's armor with a blue cape, and a red tabard that hung between Rennala's legs. Her head was now adorned in a full helmet with a metal point, its visor worn up to reveal her face. Rennala got to her feet, rolling her shoulders and cursing the smarting pain in her abdomen from where Gehrman had nearly skewered her. A fate that would not have been pleasant had she not summoned her armor. Well now, armor had long fallen out of use in my time, but to see a warrior queen is a novel balm to these old eyes. A voice called out over the clearing. Rennala looked up, setting her face in a firm rictus when she saw Gehrman perched atop an outcropping of rubble. Glaive reverted to its scythe form that he rested over a shoulder. Coiled muscle and tense gait roiled under his weather-battered clothes, but for now it seemed a lull had fallen over the battlefield, and Rennala took advantage to catch her breath and plan her next move. To ease not my royal armor, for that is style over substance. Thy attack caught me unawares, and 'twas all I could conjure in the moment. She called back sternly, engaging him in conversation and giving her more time to plan. Gehrman snorted self-deprecatingly, "Don't sell yourself short. That rain of blue you dropped on me would have caused me serious trouble had I not had this," he said, holding up his hand. A chain was wrapped around his wrist from which hung a round chunk of some chalky material. Carved into the amulet was an esoteric rune that Rennala did not recognize, beating with a red glow. Gehrman palmed the amulet, looking at it with nostalgia. Thumerian blood, heady stuff, able to absorb most witchlight or whatever your so-called sorcery is made of. Despite the mocking nature of the words, they were spoken without a shred of malice. Rennala reappraised the gruff old man. It was not that he thought less of her powers, just that he didn't understand them. "Another cantrip from your home." Gehrman's smirk turned pained. He looked down at the amulet and squeezed, cruising it into powder that blew away into the wind. "A student of mine gave it to me long ago, but absorbing that blast used up its blood, so I can't use it anymore. A decent trade to land that hit." There was a wistful melancholy in those words, that told Rennala that there was much to this old hunter that had shaped him into what he was now. All that remained was the why. "Blood, are you one of Moog's pale-blooded dregs then?" Rennala asked, getting a deadpan stare in response. "Apparently not." "Quite," Gehrman snorted in amusement, buoyed by how Rennala could be both blunt and eloquent when the situation required it. Rennala was quite happy to let him talk, for it gave her all the time she needed. Silently, without incantation, gesture or crest, Rennala began to conjure magical particles at a distance, silently drawing them together behind Gehrman. But for this to work she would need time. She tapped her catalyst to the floor, taking up an impartial yet imperious stance and inspected the segmented joints of her mailed fist. "To tell the truth, 'tis been centuries since I last wore this martial raiment. Not since the armies of the Golden Order first rolled into my people's lands." She fixed him with a piercing stare. "So I must ask thee. For what reason doth thou plague my lands now? You claim to be but an old hunter, yet the ground rattles to the sound of invaders in my home." The air changed then, Gehrman's lined face shifting like tectonic plates. "The Redmanes are a useful distraction, though I had hoped they would be far more than that." His words were shrewd and low, and Rennala kept her face to match, giving nothing away as she continued to pull magic together behind Gehrman. A small and thin needle of glintstone was taking form in the air behind him. Still, word of the Redmanes set her blood boiling and stomach squirming, adding to the feeling of something being amiss. She had forgotten something so important that she had ached to know what it was. No Redmane would turn arms against Caria. My son's war brothers are without equal or reproach. And yet, there they stand, trying to burn that academy of yours to the ground. Gehrman finished her sentence wearily, leaning on his own scythe like a cane. When I first met Jaren and his men, I thought they were quite something. Full of vitality and will that I hadn't seen in an age. Jaren, but why? She wondered. To her perspective she could still fondly remember the old Carrion house guest. How Radon had taken a liking to him and named him the Castellan of Redmane when the castle had been gifted to the budding young general. Often crossing blades along with young Loretta and underscore. Her heart seized and she had to grip her catalyst all the tighter. There it was again, the void in her memories. I had initially thought of them as a band of young heroes but now see that they have become so swept up in their adventure and honor, that they are committing atrocities. Jaren is mired in a filth of the brain, an obsession that will bring him no peace. Rennala bit her lip, she just needed a little more time. Art thou not the same? Playing to the strings of an unseen muse. German paused, taking stock of what to say. I was sent here to hunt the moon that bewitched the. Curb thine tongue if thou speak ill of mine betrothed. Rennala barked. Aha! German liked the fire in Rennala's eyes, he chuckled fondly, of course. My patron wishes you removed from the picture. And the moon is a font of madness that can ill be allowed to mingle with great powers. So I do not swing my blades for an outer god, I do so for myself. To gain my measure of you and decide if you need to die. For that is the hunt. To strike down that which cannot be allowed to mingle with society. The needle was formed, 4 inches in length and half an inch thick. A basic construct of glintstone. Rennala had heard all she needed, and while German may have been more nuanced than she originally thought, he still had to fall for her to protect the ones she loved. I cannot convince thee to abandon this path. Not until either my death, yours or I pass judgment through my blades. German pronounced. Rennala sighed, then perish. And the glintstone needle was sent zipping towards the back of German's head. It must have alerted some preternatural sixth sense the first hunter had, because he whirled, instead taking the needle in the shoulder with a grunt of pain. The second blood Rennala had drawn from him. She cursed her missed chance for a swift end but resolutely closed her helmet's visor and readied to continue the battle. German yanked out the needle and tossed it to the floor, jumping into the fray with his scythe, ready to lock blades with the armored monarch. And all the time, the void in her memories never left her mind, nor the pain it brought. What hath I forgotten that pains me so? 0.0.0.0. Back at the academy things had taken a turn for the wondrous. Both the floating city and academy proper had been shielded within the great concentric domes of water that formed the curtains of tranquility, preventing any direct penetration into the heart of Neocaria. However, the change had happened so quickly that some of the inhabitants still rushed around, confused as to the sudden change in the air. Melina winked her lone unsealed eye in curiosity, looking at a shaft of light coming through a skylight. Naruto's first yet youngest charge was in a wood-paneled former classroom that had been retrofitted into a somewhat cozy living room in the forward campus buildings. Millicent and Selen joined her, each with their own looks of intrigue or weariness. They were watched over by the Radagon's Red Wolf and the dithering but otherwise uncompromised visage of Irina, who wrung her hands. She had been leading the trio of young girls in a lesson in etiquette when they had felt the change. What on earth is going on? Millicent asked, looking towards the door. The room had no windows save for the skylights up above that gave them no clue as to what was going on. And something was definitely going on. There had been a distant explosion that echoed over the lands, followed by the sounds of many people running and yelling through the halls. Melina, ever the adventurous little girl, had initially wanted to bolt out and find out what was going on, but Irina had managed to keep her contained for now. It was quite amazing how her soft voice could keep the rambunctious girl contained when Naruto and Rennala at times could not. Melina held up a hand to cup her ear, listening deeply, hearing the sound of water. She said, her dainty eyebrows rising in confusion. Of course, Selen smacked her elfin face, shaking her head to chide herself. I felt the flow of magic change in the air. I mean, mother, she began, still getting used to referring to the woman as her mother but at least no longer seething at the prospect. Mother Irani must have brought the wards up to a wartime setting. Which means someone is attacking the academy. Who would do something like that? The Queen and Lord Naruto haven't done anything to rouse such ire, Irina wondered, looking around furtively, her blindfolded eyes providing no answers. Millicent paled while on the other end of the scale Melina looked elated, beginning to animated shadow box, as if preparing to smack these unknown invaders herself. Millicent however remained still, her eyes lost their focus and stared dead-eyed into space. The sound of footsteps approaching the door caused most of them to turn to the sound, guarded and weary. The Red Wolf stalked to the front of the group, putting itself between them and the door protectively, its eyes fixed on it as a low growl rumbled from its throat. The handle turned and Selen let out a sigh of relief when a familiar iron helmet poked in through the door. Oh, it's just Boggart. Boggart twitched, the face behind the mask likely rankling at the semi-calm dismissal of the little sorceress. Whatcha mean it's just me, little minx, he barked, coming into the room fully, and immediately the amused look of relief on Selen's face thinned at seeing he was armed. Everything okay in here? Oh, Boggart, Irina said, making her way around the armchair she had been leaning against towards where she heard her fellow resident's voice. Thank goodness you're here. What's going on outside? It sounds like mischief most foul. The blackguard sheathed the short sword he was carrying, smoothing his clothes down even though Irina was unable to see the sign of nervousness. A scoff echoed over the room, an attack, obviously. Probably one quite bad if the wards have been brought up to full. Selin mused. She looked at the shaft of sunlight that Melina was so interested in and noted that it had been hued blue with a shimmer of refracted light. She frowned as it occurred to her how poor things must be going. Her words were met with a nod from Boggart. Raiders of some kind if what Moongram said was right when I passed him on the stairs. Ranni doesn't want to take any chances so she turned on those bloody waterfall things, he said, drawing a small noise of worry from Irina, now worried that the lunar princess was placed into such a demanding position. I came to make sure you lot were okay. Irina blushed at the brash blackguard's words, which the shadow-boxing Melina thought was very cute. Selin shook her head in Millicent. Millie, Melina said in a voice no louder than a whisper. Melina was still staring off into space silently, and while that was disconcerting in its own right, Melina began to notice a twitch in her face, like paralyzed muscles were trying work through a seizure to express something. Millie, what's wrong? Oblivious to the conversation between two of her charges, Irina gestured towards where she thought the door was. Well, if that's the case, I suggest we barricade the door and hold down the fort until the crisis has passed. You could say that again. And here I was hoping I could just get through today without some of that blonde bastard's bollocks being dropped on my head. Boggart began looking around the room for anything large and heavy, settling on a tall oak dresser that he began to push, its feet scraping on the wooden floor. Close and lock the door. Get a seat under the handle if you can. Melina came to the front of her red-headed sister, looking into her gold eyes and knew instantly something was deeply wrong. Those twin auric orbs were frantically looking around the room as if seeing specters in every shadow. Melina held out a hand and touched Millicent's shoulder, only to recoil when she felt something shift beneath the skin. Millicent's eyes glowed with a sapphire-colored intensity before narrowing to slits, then let out a scream that split the air. Everyone instantly moved to the girl's side, Millicent hugging herself and clawing at her little gown. Ah-gee-gee-gee-gee-h-h-h-h-h, she violently smacked at her own chest, trying to claw at her skin, the veins in her face angorning from the pressure of her blood. No, away, away. Selin got to her first, grabbing both of Millicent's wrists and holding them away from her. She nearly lost her grip when she felt the squirming under her skin but held firm. Millicent, tell me what's wrong, she asked, getting no response beyond more screaming. Irina tried to reach out to help but Selin hissed, keep back, Miss Irina, there is something amiss here that you are ill-suited to attend. Irina looked unsure but the sureness with which Selin had pronounced her words cowed her to letting the sorceress handle it. She set her blue eyes to meet Millicent's gold, not knowing what she was seeing. Millicent, I can't help me if you don't talk to me, she said, gritting her teeth at the effort it took to stop Millicent from powering out of her grip and hurting herself. She needed something to ground her back to the here and now, even if it meant she had to take a leap of faith. She took a deep breath and barked out a curt and concise shout. Apprentice, get a hold of yourself. The other girl's eyes darted around the room for a few seconds more before clarity suddenly broke through her fugue state, pupils dilating and finally seeing who was in front of her. Selin, she said hoarsely, her voice sounded exhausted. The movement under her skin bled away, still present but massively reduced. Letting go of her wrists, Selin held Millicent by the shoulders and nodded once to her, as if agreeing to not address the compromising state her sister had just been in. Melina walked up, adding to the moment with a hug, what's wrong, Millie? Millicent swallowed thickly, looking between her two concerned sisters and the equally concerned adults. The rot, it's awake. It calls to its kin, to my kin. My sisters have come. Boggart looked at Irina who frowned worriedly, they remained silent as the three girls talked. Selin took the lead. And this connection, do you think they can sense you in turn? She asked, desperate for details. While the majority of her sorcery studies and experimentation was based in the field of logic, she knew better than to cast out esoteric connections like this. After all, the rot could be seen as one collective being with a myriad of vectors that could be tracked. Or perhaps she just didn't want to admit that she trusted her sister and apprentice implicitly and the last remnants of her old pride were stubborn. Red hair bobbed sadly. Millicent cast her mind out along the sanguine stands of rot at the base of her mind. Most often than not she never had to deal with them these days, barely even aware they were there, but now they writhed and through them she gained a skein of prescience, like peeking through a bramble-thick hedge into the wider world beyond. 4. Blooms. Were very close, growing closer with a slow but sure march. They're inside the academy. What? Boggart yelped. He kicked the dresser he had been pushing in turmoil. Some bloody protection those waterfall things ended up being. They're meant to mitigate an invading force. They haven't been fine-tuned to take out select individuals that hide their identities, nitwit. Selin chided him as she rubbed circles into her sister's arms. Is there anything else you can sense? Millicent focused on the vague awareness, and found that she could. It was far further away and far more indistinct but much bigger. Like a dawn through the mist, the radiance obscured but its monstrous might still burning through. There was a warmth there that she recognized, but it was hued in peals of potent anger, and around it she heard the rot scream before falling silent. Father is angry. Both adults shivered at that. The simple words carried a foreboding to them that made each feel as if someone was walking over their graves yet unmade. All the more reason to block the door, Boggart said, beginning to push the dresser again. Give us a hand, Miss Irina. Oh yes, Irina replied and felt for the dresser, letting herself be guided into the right place by Boggart. She pressed her back against the dresser and added what strength she could. Selin helped Millicent clean her tears and offered soothing words as she snuffled, adding to the grunts of exertion from the two adults. But one in this group was silent, and instead of her usual peppy and quixotic adorable energy, Melina was disquietingly focused. Her hands were slowly balling into fists, as pudgy as they were. A wrathful look that unknowingly mirrored her father's clouded her face like a deadly tempest. People had come and attacked them in their home. People had come here with the intent to hurt her family and those they protected, to ruin the work that they had put in enough to make her father, her sweet papa, so furious that he could be sensed from the other end of the continent. Radagon's red wolf turned to look at her, its ears pricking up, feeling a presence that was familiar to it, the physicality of his first and original master for which he was named. Such was the intensity that when Melina walked towards him he did not resist when she climbed onto his back and clutched his fur as if it were the reins of a burdened beast. Melina, Millicent said, noticing the change in her sister. She looked back at the redhead with a blank look, her face set in a thin line, and for a moment, Millicent could have sworn a phantom overlaid Millicent, two faces overlaying hers, much older and regal and full of righteous anger in their gold eyes that were so much like hers. She blinked and the phantoms were gone, and Melina's face flashed into a smile. I'm gonna go beat up all the meanies who want to hurt my sisters, she said almost conversationally before kicking her heels into the wolf. It reared up and howled, scaring the pants off of the adults before it charged for the doorway, smashing the door to splinters as it galloped through it. They all shared a look before Selin took Millicent's hand and pulled her towards the door. We should not linger. That door would not have been able to hold back the kindred of rot, so we best make our way to somewhere a bit more secure. Irina looked conflicted, swallowing thickly before finally saying, Queen Renala's apartments then. Boggart stared open-mouthed from behind his mask before drawing his short sword and taking point. Keep close. 0.0.0.0. The halls of the Raya Lucaria were chaotic and noisy, far different from the usually scholarly silence that had filled them for centuries even before the shattering. The refugees from the floating city and riverside were being shepherded into the halls and classrooms that could hold them by the members of the militia and men at arms under the direction of Moongram and Blade, who remained in the floating city, intent on coordinating the evacuation efforts and taking the fight to any of the attackers who managed to make it through the maze of paths. Men and women shouted and cried while people attempted to calm them that the academy was safe. The armed men were going from room to room in small 5-man squads, making sure to find rooms that would be best to host people and not wanting bottlenecks in the passage of people. A crush was the last thing they wanted. They were caught unawares when the ground was suddenly shaken by an explosion far below, the ground trembling for a moment and dust falling from the arched hallways above them before settling. What passed for an officer amongst the militia dispatched a small squad to go investigate the cause, sending them down the stairs into the dimly lit underbelly of the subterranean floors. At first everything seemed normal until they came to a room that looked as if it had been hit with a small-scale hurricane. Its furniture had been knocked and shattered to the floor and the entire far side wall had been desecrated, a smoking hole punched in the masonry that appeared to come from the outside. The leader of the 5-man squad walked towards the hole with a lit torch in hand and his sword in the other, seeing something silvery glitter from within the passage that expanded beyond. A series of sharp whistles reached his ears as a dozen arrows flew from the hole, a throwing knife whizzing out and hitting the leader in the leg and causing him to cry out with pain, a fate that matched the other 4 who collapsed to the ground in pain. But before the leader could fall to his own knees he suddenly felt a strong hand lock around his throat and squeeze. He wheezed and sputtered as he was lifted into the air and forced to look into the visage of his attacker, a red hood obscuring his eyes and an unkempt white beard covering most of his face. "Where is Sorceress Selin?" Witch Hunter Jaren demanded in a no-nonsense tone. The man he was holding attempted to stab at him with his sword, but Jaren disarmed him with a flick of his Zweihander, the longsword the militiaman carried clattering the floor. Beside Jaren, his 20 best men filed past him and into the storage room where Radahn's secret entrance had ended up at. They had not had the luxury of his general's gravity magic, so had to rely on a jury-rigged blasting charge to get through the wall. Gasping for air, the militia lieutenant jerked in the Castellan's iron grip, foam at the corners of his mouth and eyes turning bloodshot. Jaren lightened his grip a fraction, allowing precious air back into his prisoner's lungs that he drank in greedily. "Yughk mean the princess?" A vein popped in Jaren's temple and his grip on the Neo-Carrion's throat became vice-like. The man struggled, kicking against Jaren's chest to no avail before finally he passed out and Jaren stalked forwards, murder in his eyes. He would spare this one, as he was likely under this mad place's spell, but anyone who stood to defend these evil witches would be cut down without a moment's remorse. Little did Jaren know, he was not the only one running amok in the Academy's innards. It began as nothing more than a whisper, a breath of a rumor that there was fighting going on in the halls. It was dismissed as hysteria conjured up by idle hands and fear. But then militia patrols began to stop checking in. The distant sound of steel on steel and screams of pain began to echo through the halls, growing closer to the hastily designated refugee areas. Until finally a name was put to the cause, one that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. The dread sigil of Mount Gelmir, 40 men strong and armed to the teeth. Militiamen, knights and even men and women who wished to defend their families ran from their rooms and the order was given for the people to evacuate to the higher reaches of the Academy. There had been no major deaths yet, but they did not wish to become fish in a barrel for the recusants that had somehow got in while the queen and king were away. "Go, go, get to higher ground," a knight ordered a family, making sure their son did not trip on the stairs as they scarpered to rise up to a safer area. That was the 6th family he had evacuated in so many minutes. He turned looking for more when a swirl of gray cloth exiting the doorway to the room caught his eye. "You there, don't run off," he shouted, running towards the door. He turned, seeing the last of a quartet of hooded individuals walking down the hall away from them. "Stop." Coming to a stop as one, the 4 did not turn to face the knight who stormed towards them, annoyance in his eyes but care in his heart. He reached for one's shoulder. "You really shouldn't BGHN." Pain exploded into his gut with stinging agony, filling his abdomen with white-hot torture. He slowly looked down and was confused to see the spearhead of a long-shafted weapon dug into his stomach, a wicked halo blade under it. The one holding it turned to half-profile, revealing a smiling face before the halo scythe was withdrawn in a clean pull, snagging his gits out as it came. They spilled onto the floor with a wet slap and the knight collapsed to his knees but felt his assailant grab him and bring him gently to sit against the wall. "Shish," the hooded figure hushed, pulling back her hood to reveal a shock of crimson-red hair, her eyes hidden by a white bandage. "There is nothing to fear. The pain is a blessing, a sign of things to come." "Yes, yes, of wondrous things. Of sweet odor and scented mildew," said another in a sing-song voice. "Of an age where our mother wakes and blooms thrice, bringing the world true horror," said the third, her face at the first shoulder, looking down at him with a smile. "And once the world knows true horror," cooed the 4th and final member in the youngest voice, "then they can join hands in the gift of rot." The first leaned down, holding out her arm and opening her gloved hand as if to show the dying man something. In her hand was a scarlet flower that glowed as it bloomed from her palm. "A gift we give to you, to celebrate our coming reunion," said Mary, the eldest sister. And with a mania of sweetest innocence, she pushed the rotted bloom into the knight's open guts, and watched him begin to change. 0.0.0.0 A whip of Kurama's chakra cracked against a barb of the rot, loosening one of the last remaining elements of the accursed divine plague from Naruto's body. But the success brought the mightiest of the Biju no pleasure or contentment. His vulpine maw was pulled back in a snarl the likes of which he hadn't worn in a few years since that debacle on the moon with the descendant of the sage's brother. This was of a much less grandiose nature than fighting a mountain-sized golem of moon rock, but was far too close to home for Kurama to feel anything but vivid discontent. Kurama had succeeded in repelling almost every single physical symbol and symptom of the rot, and whatever was getting in, was rendered down to nothing more than a prickling of the skin. He had told Naruto that his work was nearly done and he could safely leave the swamp of Ionia, setting to the much simpler task of getting back to Liurnia. But Naruto had not replied to Kurama, continuing to hack and slash away at the beasts of rot that now ran in fear from him, tearing across the land and launching waves of green and black energy from his twin swords. He had tried again and again to talk to Naruto to dissuade him from his wrathful dirge, but Naruto remained trapped in his topper. Something was definitely amiss, because he had not seen Naruto in such a rage since the days when he had yet to give his chakra willingly. The situation was markedly different in that Naruto's anger was entirely personal, stoked to hysteria by the mental effects of the rot and perpetuated by whatever power coursed in from the great runes. In fact, the longer Naruto fought, the more prominent the runes became. Kurama felt them growing in brightness. He sat up and looked at the portion of the floor where Naruto would usually appear when he entered the mindscape. Etched into the floor were the great runes that Naruto had come into possession of, with Godric's anchor rune in the middle. Usually they remained inert chicken scratches on the floor, but now they glowed hotly, gold light filling the usually pleasantly dim mental plane. Damn eyesore, Kurama growled, closing his eyes and shaking his head. The time for half measures had passed. His concern for Naruto's degenerating mood and lack of responses had thinned his patience to the point of no return. Get in here, Naruto. Kurama exerted a concentrated hook of focused intent on Naruto, aiming to forcefully drag him into the mindscape to give him an earful. This wasn't like when he usually prodded Naruto's consciousness and the blonde let himself be pulled inside to talk face to face. It was more akin to the direct yanks at his waking mind when he needed to drag his Jinchuriki in for a word, usually to roar at them to give up their bodies. It was brutal, direct, but it could not be refused. That line of thought guttered and died when the collection of runes carved at Kurama's feet exploded with energy, a crackle of brilliant gold lightning and sparkling stardust striking out towards Kurama. The fox brought up his arms to guard against the unexpected event, the light striking his crossed forearms and sending him back a dozen meters with a grunt. What the hell? Kurama openly shouted, having no need to keep his reaction internal. The orange fur covering forearms smoked subtly, singed by the searing hot power, but he was otherwise unscathed and far more interested in the pillar of light that now lit up the entire mindscape like a sun. It shimmered and coiled in a helix that rose unending into the dark sky of the mental landscape. It was not a uniform column of energy but undulated and shifted, dark voids filled with heat haze and stardust filling in the gaps that showed up between the individual threads of light. No, not threads, Kurama realized, strings. He scowled at the tacky gold light source and stalked up to it, rearing back a clawed hand and slashing at the tower, expecting a reaction and prepared. A massive shower of sparks flowed from the point of impact, but Kurama did not retreat, grinding his razor-sharp claws against the gold strings seeking to snip them at the source. Surprise took him when he felt more than just searing power crackling out from the compromised pillar of string. He felt emotions from them, ones that he realized were neither his nor Naruto's. Imperious gloating, ambivalence, aggravation and indulgent exaltation vibrated within every single string, until finally he heard it. Twang. The musical note rushed through Kurama, snaking up his arm from where his hand gripped some of the strings. The gossamer strands pulsed with renewed power and finally repulsed Kurama's hand. He looked between his smoking claws and the helix of light and he felt his ire rise to a fever pitch. He recognized this power, even if his time in contact with it amounted to a single conversation felt second-hand through Naruto's senses. Cursed outer god, you take advantage of my partner when he is at his lowest. Kurama roared, rising to his full height and extending both sets of claws, his 9 long tails fanning out behind him. The mindscape shook with the force of Kurama's titanic bellow, now charging at the helix of strings and seizing a hold of the tower, ignoring the energetic feedback that spat lightning and celestial energy against him like hot oil from a skillet. Claws dug deep into the bands, attempting to push the attacker away every time he dug his razor-edged digits deeper into the metaphysical matter, seeking to rip it from where it bore into Naruto's soul. A great presence passed over Kurama's senses and Kurama's blood boiled at its closeness, unsurprised when he heard a familiar aloof and imperious voice speak. Cease thine intervention, tailed one. I am doing what I should have done long ago and setting my beast on the path he should have walked instead of taking pity on the whore's offshoot. Tightening his grip on the strings, Kurama growled at the voice, just as arrogant as he remembered it. You foul up my partner's soul by being here, you overly sanctimonious despot. What have you done to Naruto? The voice made an approving hum, preening at the fox's aggregation and anger. Reveling in the discontent of a lower lifeform. The mendicant lord's anchor rune once bore my direct touch, rendered deadened by that foreign blade of destined death. But landing in the heart of the rot offered a splendid opportunity, to retie those severed strings in the moments his constitution was weakened. You're the reason he can't hear me, Kurama accused, ripping a string loose and chomping down on another bundle of the stuff with contempt. Indeed, deafening him to any distractions but my grand designs. and lacking the wits to realize the voice he hears is the one he has stubbornly refused to obey. The fingers pluck the strings, and the beast shall be a beast, free to bring down the world and rebuild it as one with true order. The words were spoken with such belief and dripped with self-love so great it made Kurama want to retch. Instead Kurama dug his heels in and clawed and chewed at the helix, glaring into the sky far above. His name is Naruto. He is not some beast to be sicked upon that which displeases you for not perfectly dancing to your tune. Desist from this pathetic rebellion. Tailed 1. My name is Kurama, mightiest of the Biju, and so help me I will rip you from the soil of his soul like a weed and cast you into the void. Kurama raged, the tone and actions of the incorporeal being driving him utterly up the wall. He renewed his slashes and bites, attacking the pillar of light to seemingly no effect. Gritting his pointed teeth, he struck out with his tails, the 9 long appendages locking around the toe and holding it still, pulling it in reverse as he continued to hack and scratch at it. And this time, his attacks did tangible damage to the divine filaments. Where once only sparks and shocks of hot energy returned from his strikes, now stray strings were knocked loose from the tower, cleaved of their connection to Naruto. It would take a lot of work, but he would not rest until he snapped this link once and for all. As he worked, arms a blur of tooth and claw, Kurama became aware of something bizarre. Information was beginning to trickle into the back of his mind, growing steadily more defined with every clump of string he knocked loose. Emotions. Intent. A name. Not a title, but a name. And with that name clutched deep in his mind he yanked and chopped, working to save his partner from the inside out. You will never be a mindless beast, especially not to a false god. Line X break. Azure blue met brutal gray as German blocked the weight of Renala's latest overhead strike on the blunt side of his scythe. She channeled more magic into it, increasing the width of the Carrion greatsword that covered her catalyst, a minor shift in orientation sending the translucent blade scraping along top of the scythe until it caught on the weighted end of the shaft where it intersected with the burial blade. The scythe was wrenched to one side, causing German to withdraw before his opening was left exposed for too long. Renala capitalized, dismissing the greatsword to reorient the much shorter and easier to control catalyst before reforming its spectral covering, doubling it in length and width and launching a horizontal slash at German. The first hunter cursed loudly, dropping to his knees and letting the sword pass over him, launching a crescent moon wave of blue energy into the forest behind him that they ran and battled through. He sprang to his feet and sprinted towards her, his clothes billowing around him like a spirit. Renala waved her catalyst, a chime of magic making German instinctually change direction to avoid more spellfire. She smiled behind her visor, for the move had been a feint. The energy wave of her slash cut into the trunk of an ancient oak behind the hunter, the massive tree creaking before beginning the slow, pendulous fall towards the whirling attacker. Splintering wood was hardly a subtle sound and German clocked the shadow of the falling tree as it fell towards him. He turned to the side, sharply turning on his good foot and using the force to swing his scythe in a vertical arc, slicing through the tree before it could hit him. His advance was however broken, so when he returned to look at his target he inhaled sharply as she drove the bladed tip of her catalyst into the soil, his sixth sense telling him to get high as fast as possible. Fly, she said, her voice echoing through the visor of her helmet as she pumped magic into the floor. The ground shook with a sudden sharp tremor before sharp and thick glintstone crystals quickly burst from the ground in front of Renala as a wave of stalagmites, rushing towards German who turned tail and ran, springing up into the trees to avoid the tidal wave of spikes. Thou cannot run. Come, oathsworn wolves. A dozen translucent direwolves faded into existence beside the full moon queen before bolting for German, hopping off the tops of the crystal spires to snap at his heels. He booted one in the face and skewered the second through the skull with his peg leg. German broke the scythe and began to pepper Renala with shots, using the trees to cover his movements, a lucky shot impacting on her pauldron. She pressed a hand to the hit, feeling the cracks in the silvery plate and took stock of the situation. She had the ranged advantage but the skill of the first hunter kept her on her toes. She could not afford to engage him at close range lest he slip her guard and deliver a killing blow before she could recover. But there was also the matter of the void in her memories. 'Tis suicide to engage him in a melee, but when I do, I feel the itch in my mind recede. The more I fight, the more I learn what I have forgotten. Renala thought, and against her better judgment, she took to the sky and closed the distance. She had to find where spellfire met bladework. O light of the moon, guardian shine to the Carrion lineage, return to me what I have lost, and guide my love back to my side. Black and sparkling green blades crossed over one another, severing the trunk-like neck of the horror that gurgled in pain before collapsing to the floor, no longer moving. Darkly colored sparks danced along the neck stump's locus before they ignited, a quiet roar of inky black flame subsuming the body as an aura of true death radiated from it. The one who had inflicted the wounds gave no heed to it, continuing his pursuit. The creatures of rot were running from Naruto now and had been ever since his great runes and emitted their pulse of harmonious light. To beings that were so corrupted, the sweet gold embrace of those runes were anathema, and even with their brains dripping from their ears in putrid red, they instinctively feared what was their opposite. Doom through salvation, compassion made into a weapon, life making war on undeath. Had the blonde been in a different state, he might have introspected on that. On the fact that the lands between were so deeply broken that even the cycle of life and death was itself somewhere in between. But right now he was focused on his wrathful task. His chakra flowed into the moonlight greatsword, its broad length glowing with hauntingly beautiful light before he slashed it at a fleeing flock of malformed crows, sending a crescent-shaped wave of energy soaring through the air at breakneck speed. It seemed to earn through the air, going from horizontal to diagonal before it sliced through the flock, bifurcating most of them and those that remained losing wings to the shimmering attack. They squawked in pain as they fell to the Kaled sands. Naruto had chased them out of the swamp of Ionia and into the greater wastes where he systematically hunted and diced them to bits. It was not clean work, but it brought Naruto satisfaction to see the rotted fall and never get up again. His anger dipped a moment at that, the joy souring. That was not a very, Naruto thought. The blonde shinobi did love a good scrap and even an exhilarating battle, but he had never reveled in the systematic extermination of a kind. As time passed and he brought their numbers lower and lower, he felt like the red mist in front of his vision shifted. It did not recede but rather turned, presenting new facets like the sides of a gemstone that brought with them nuggets of clarity. Eventually, that lucidity brought him to a standstill in the desert, the full length of Kaiman buried up to the hilt in a dog-like creature's chest. It whimpered at him pitiably before the arcane nature of the black Odachi leached the life from the canine and it stopped struggling, inert as death took him. This action felt right, but what didn't feel right was the blood that sloughed off the moonlight greatsword. Not used, he panted, hand tensing around the hilt. The blade had been made with an intent, a role that it was supposed to serve. To be used to defend his family and home, not a furious march of execution in a foreign land. Renola, he breathed. Something snapped deep in the back of his mind and Naruto could have sworn he heard Kurama whooping in a triumphant growl. No, stay angry, Naruto, they deserve this. It's much better to just not think. Just swing your swords and make those disgusting pretender gods bleed. The voice shouted from the back of Naruto's mind, dismayed. The glowing gold Naruto grabbed the sides of his head and gritted his head, feeling the haze attempting to reassert itself. What the hell are you? He growled, the rough surfaces of his sword cutting into his palms. The prior anger had been so extreme that he had pushed away all upper thoughts, letting emotion guide him in an addictive spiral. He was kept in his lane by the hallmarks of familiarity, the way chakra and blood thundered through him, the sharpening pepe of adrenaline and the occasional voice in the back of his head offering counsel. But now Naruto realized this was not the usual voice. Kurama raged in the back of his mind, his voice muffled but growing louder as he made progress on his own battle. The voice seemed to sneer at him, its emotion conveyed through sheer presence. It doesn't matter, I have given you encouragement and power. It is about time you hold up your side of the bargain and do my bidding. That confounded humanity of yours is proving a thorn in my side I can no longer allow. Naruto grunted as white-hot pain lanced into his head, the voice losing whatever prior feigned friendliness it had possessed before and defaulting back to a sickeningly familiar imperiousness. Naruto realized immediately who he was speaking to. Greater will, he seethed. Or was it? The voice was the same. That same haughty, holier-than-thou disposition that had ticked Naruto off since he had first heard it, suspended beneath a nebulae of perfectly arrayed stars. But for some reason he could not define, that was not the mental image that Naruto felt now. There was a tinniness to it, as if instead of a grand voice speaking from on high it was someone speaking to the sky and the sky echoed their words back at him, magnified, but he could see the one speaking in his subconscious. There were no stars, just simulacra. What the hell are you? Naruto gasped, pushing back against the artificially imposed anger with his own, feeling it push back along the metaphysical link. At this point, the will abandoned all pretense of being civil. Fatherless cretin, insufferably pedantic beast, perpetually vexing whoreson, why do you persist in denying the grandness I have laid out for you? To be the cornerstone and foundation of a perfect world. Ah, there it was. Petulance in all its metaphysical glory, or lack thereof. Naruto's bared teeth morphed into an insulting grin, the orange-gold eyes of his chakra mode glinting with viscous mirth. I have had my fill of gods saying how the world should be. He yelled in defiance, chakra exploding away from him in a shockwave that cratered the ground beneath him. Nagato, Obito, Madara, Kagaya, Zetsu, Tonari, that's Shitheel Godric. Whoever you are, whatever you are, you're just the latest in a long line of people telling me that they know the way the world should be. So let me tell you this. He began to draw in senjutsu from the surrounding area, finding it coming into him with a startling ease, his runes singing in response to it. Like all those before, if you hurt those I care for, I'm gonna kick your ass. He was met with an aggravated sound that was akin to an orchestra suddenly going out of tune. Naruto smirked, red pigment phasing into view around his eyes. He felt his perception rapidly expand over Caelid and far beyond, taking in the details of the world in flashes of clarity. The red-stained sands of the southern lands felt like a blight on his senses, a malignant tumor slowly growing outwards into the flesh of the land. The blonde's challenging grin suddenly fell as he sensed something that pressed into his waking mind, his now cross-shaped pupils narrowing to pinpricks. There was a presence on the other side of Caelid that filled Naruto's perception like a celestial body, so large and heavy that it seemed to warp the rot-infected land around it. There was someone there, something of immense power but tragically diminished. Still unimaginably strong but a shadow of what it had once been. Radon, Naruto's mind supplied, putting two and two together from what he had been told. He was taken aback at the power that thrummed off the distant figure as he skulked across the sands, but there too was the unmistakable touch of Hirot, soaking into every facet of his being. He could feel the man's emotions, searingly brutal pain, weariness, self-recrimination and forlorn denial wafting off the great general in waves. Normally, Naruto would have gone to the man, tried to see what was wrong and help as best he could. But peeking beyond the warped presence of the Redmane Lord, Naruto was acutely reminded of why he was here. His smile wilted completely and the will laughed with derision. Then see, errant best. See what happens when you are not around your so-called loved ones. How quickly things fall to chaos. Sage mode, depending on its level, could provide Naruto with an acute level of clairvoyance about the state of the world beyond the immediate sensory range of Sage mode. Shortly after he had first gained access to Kurama's chakra, entering Sage mode had let him glimpse brief snapshots of the war despite the theaters of battle being half a continent away. Not enough to get a grip of the situation, but enough to see that thousands were dying and the ground was being churned up by the destructive nature of war. That could reach as far as being able to sense chakra signatures in other dimensions with the power that he had gained from Hagoromo. Bearing the cross-shaped pupils and red-eye pigment of Biju Sage mode, Naruto experienced a clairvoyant vision of Neo Carria locked in battle. Fear and terror mixing with the glee of the invaders. He snarled, sensing the mellifluous touch of the daughters of Rot or unknown figures running through the shadows of the academy with murder in their hearts. But above it all, he locked in on the cool blue light of Renola, locked in pitch combat with a gray shadow that curdled his blood. Renola, he whispered. She was fighting, full of worry and self-doubt. Renola, he said, his orange-gold eye slowly bleeding to red. Her gray-clad adversary discharged his weapon at her, causing her to take cover behind a tree. Naruto's rage boiled hot and viscous, shirking the will's petulant wrath and blazing so bright that his chakra responded. The aura of gold around Naruto intensified, smaller motes blooming into it like stars and the patterns running over his body rippling, as if on the eve of change. Renola, he called, the sand beneath his feet superheating into glass. And just like that the snapshot clairvoyance faded, leaving just the distant blue light in Naruto's sage senses. The blonde's pips pulled back and teeth lengthened to fangs, his body grew tense as power flowed from him like a burst dam before pulling inwards, building up pressure. The air grew thick before finally the voice spoke in an indulgent, mocking candor. As if a beast could ever save its whore from the chaos. Naruto exploded into the air in a pillar of sparkling golden light, streaking forwards as an asteroid of brilliance. Air offered a meager resistance before he smashed through the sound barrier with a resonant boom, his speed growing a dozen times over that by the time he had cleared his own mock cone. Caelid rolled under him in a blur until he burst out over the gray sea, the pressure wave of his passing causing curtains of water to rise up in his wake. There were no thoughts. There was no voice in his ears or from the back of his mind. There was only the distant blue light on his senses that he now flew towards as fast as his emotions could take him. His lover and fiancée were in peril, and he would shatter heaven and split the earth to see her safe. Line X break. The curtains of tranquility truly were a marvel of sorcery brilliance. While they may have simply looked like a massive dome of water from the outside, the interior was far more of a spectacle. A 5-man squad of Redmanes had taken shelter in the shadows of one of the outer settlements that made up the floating city, hiding from the 20 men at arms led by one of the returned knights, who ordered them to do a thorough sweep of the area. A pikeman poked his head into the open door and looked around, finding nothing but the trunks and personal effects of whatever family had been slated to move in. When he was sure that there was nothing of note, he called out the all clear and the response party moved to the next area. The group approached one of the seemingly impassable curtains of water, the sorcery in their midst coming to the front of their number. He raised his catalyst adobe his head and waved it, a chiming sound ringing out as it emitted a pulse of the sparkling glintstone sorcery. There was a pause before the wall of water reacted, a space opening in the water and widening into a fissure, then an archway wide enough for men to pass through 5 abreast, and a pathway of water formed out before it, connecting to the pathway for the troops to embark. They, sorcerer and knight, stepped onto the water and found it to be solid, followed by their subordinates who embarked a bit more gingerly, but soon the entire sortie was through the arch that shut behind them. A beat passed before the luggage in the lone house shimmered with tarnished gold light, and when it cleared stood the 5 Redmanes, a gray-haired and gold-eyed one of their number throwing back a large sheet he had used to cover them all down. Seeing they were well and truly alone now, the group breathed a sigh of relief and took stock of the situation. They had been part of the original group of Redmanes that had managed to get into the floating city before the curtains of tranquility had been raised. Not only did the magical arrangement account for thousands of tons of fast-flowing water acting as a potent protection from external attacks, but the controller could freely rearrange the orientation of the walls. Streets could be turned into dead ends or doors be manifested for